Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The desert cold settles differently at night. During daylight hours, the Nevada sun bakes the asphalt until heat waves shimmer like ghosts above the interstate. But once darkness falls, the temperature plummets with startling speed. The air becomes sharp and dry, carrying the mineral scent of ancient lake beds and the dusty perfume of sagebrush that dots the roadside for hundreds of miles in every direction. Asa Rutledge had been driving these routes long enough to know the rhythm of the desert. At 43, he'd spent nearly 2 decades behind the wheel of various rigs, but the past 8 years had been exclusively dedicated to hauling freight across the loneliest stretches of the American West. He preferred it that way. The solitude suited him, and the pay for hazmat certification and willingness to take overnight runs through remote country was substantial enough to keep his small ranch outside Elko afloat. Tonight, he was part of a 3-truck convoy heading east on Highway 6, a ribbon of road that cuts through central Nevada like a surgeon's incision. The route wasn't his usual run, but the dispatcher had been desperate. A pharmaceutical shipment needed to reach a distribution center in Ely by morning, and the regular driver had called in sick. The cargo wasn't hazardous, just temperature-sensitive medications that required refrigerated transport. Simple enough, except the company wanted the shipment escorted for insurance purposes. Myron Keach, the convoy lead, had been driving commercial vehicles since before Asa was born. At 61, he had the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades squinting into headlights and sunrise glare. His voice over the CB radio was gravelly and deliberate, the kind of measured tone that suggested he'd seen everything the road could throw at him, and had developed a healthy respect for its unpredictability. Convoy check. Myron's voice crackled through the speaker at 11:47 p.m. Front to back, sound off. Lead truck, all systems green. Myron confirmed his own status, a habit Asa had noticed during their brief meeting at the staging area hours earlier. Middle position, running smooth, Asa responded, glancing at his mirrors. Behind him, about 300 feet back, he could see the headlights of the 3rd truck maintaining proper spacing. There was a pause, longer than expected, before the 3rd driver responded. Her name was Tamsin Quinn, and she'd been introduced at the staging area as a relief driver covering someone else's route. She looked to be in her mid-30s, with the kind of tired eyes that suggested she'd been working double shifts for too long. Her rig was hauling construction equipment, unrelated to their pharmaceutical cargo but traveling the same route, and thus absorbed into their informal convoy for safety. Tail position, all good here, Tamsin finally responded, her voice thin with fatigue. The highway stretched before them like a dark river, their headlights carving tunnels through the blackness. On either side, the desert landscape was reduced to occasional shadows, the silhouettes of distant mountains barely distinguishable against the starlit sky. Cell service had died about 30 miles back, which wasn't unusual for this region. Their CB radios were the only reliable communication, and even those would fade to static in some of the deeper valleys ahead. Asa checked his GPS. They were making good time, maintaining a steady 60 miles per hour along the relatively straight sections of highway. The next significant landmark was a defunct gas station at a crossroads called Duckwater, about 45 minutes ahead. After that, the road would begin its gradual climb into the highlands approaching Ely, where the terrain became more challenging and the curves more frequent. The monotony of night driving has a peculiar quality. The white lines clicking past create a hypnotic rhythm, and the darkness beyond the headlights becomes an abstract void that plays tricks on peripheral vision. Asa had learned to combat the dulling effect with regular checks of his mirrors, conscious adjustments of his posture, and periodic channel scans on the CB to catch fragments of other truckers' conversations that might be within range. At 12:23 a.m., Myron's voice cut through the static again. Getting some weather reports on the scanner. Possible storm system moving in from the west, but it shouldn't reach us before we're through to Ely. Keep an eye on conditions, though. Asa glanced at his side mirror, scanning the western horizon. He couldn't see any evidence of approaching weather, but in the desert, storms could materialize with startling speed. The barometric pressure gauge on his dashboard showed a slight drop. Nothing dramatic, but enough to note. "Copy that," Asa responded. "Looks clear from my position." Tamsin's response was delayed again, and when it came, there was an odd quality to her voice. "Yeah, clear back here too. Though, anyone else notice that?" "Notice what?" Myron asked, his tone shifting slightly toward alertness. Another pause. "Probably nothing. Thought I saw lights behind me for a second, but they're gone now. Might have been a reflection off something." Asa checked his own mirrors more carefully. The road behind Tamsin's truck was empty. Just darkness punctuated by the faint glow of her taillights. Highway 6 was notorious for long stretches without traffic, especially after midnight on a weeknight. It wasn't unusual to drive for an hour or more without encountering another vehicle. "Keep monitoring," Myron said. "These desert roads play tricks with light sometimes. Atmospheric conditions can bounce headlights around weird angles." The convoy continued in silence for another 20 minutes. Asa found himself checking his mirrors more frequently, though he wasn't sure why. Tamsin's mention of mysterious lights had planted a seed of unease. Or perhaps it was just the natural hypervigilance that comes with driving through complete darkness in the middle of nowhere. At 12:48 a.m., they passed the abandoned gas station at Duckwater. The structure was barely visible, just a darker shadow against the dark landscape. Its sign long since fallen or stolen. Asa had passed it dozens of times over the years, and each time he was struck by how quickly human infrastructure deteriorated when abandoned in the desert. Without constant maintenance, the environment reclaimed everything with ruthless efficiency. "Coming up on the Moorman Ranch turnoff in about 15 miles, Myron announced. "Road gets a bit twistier after that, so tighten up your following distances a touch." Asa acknowledged and noticed Tamsin's headlights creeping slightly closer in his mirror as she adjusted her spacing. The landscape was beginning to change subtly, the flat expanse giving way to gentle rises and falls as they approached the foothills. The straight highway began introducing mild curves, nothing dramatic but enough to require more attention. At 1:11 a.m., Myron's voice came through again, but this time there was an edge to it. "Dispatch is trying to reach me on the satellite phone, but I'm getting interference. Anyone else getting weird static on their radios?" Asa had noticed it, a pulsing undercurrent beneath the normal white noise. "Yeah, getting some odd feedback here. Could be atmospheric, or maybe we're picking up some military frequency. There's testing ranges out this way." "Probably that," Myron agreed, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. What none of them mentioned, what perhaps each of them had independently noticed but hadn't yet articulated, was a subtle but growing sense that something about the night felt off. It wasn't anything specific, no obvious danger or mechanical problem, just an intuitive wrongness that experienced drivers sometimes pick up on, the way animals sense earthquakes before they strike. Tamsin broke the silence at 1:19 a.m. "I'm definitely seeing lights behind me now. They're maintaining distance, maybe half a mile back." Asa checked his mirrors again. From his position, he couldn't see past Tamsin's truck to verify what she was reporting. Could be another trucker running late, decided to catch up with our convoy for company. "Maybe," Tamsin said, unconvinced. "But they're not getting any closer. Just staying back there, matching our speed exactly. Keep monitoring," Myron instructed. If they want to join up, they'll eventually close the distance and make contact on the CB. Nothing to worry about yet. But there was something to worry about, though none of them could have known it at the time. What they were experiencing, what they were about to drive into, was a phenomenon that would puzzle investigators for months afterward. A confluence of circumstances so specific and unlikely that replicating it would prove nearly impossible. At 1:34 a.m., Myron announced they were approaching a detour. A road construction sign, solar-powered and official-looking, indicated that Highway 6 was closed ahead for emergency repairs. An arrow directed traffic onto a side road that would rejoin the main highway approximately 12 miles later. "Anyone know about construction out here?" Myron asked, suspicion evident in his tone. "News to me," Asa replied, slowing as they approached the detour sign. "Seems odd they wouldn't have notified dispatch about a closure on this route." "Real odd," Myron agreed. The lead truck's brake lights flared as he slowed to a crawl, approaching the detour turnoff with obvious reluctance. "Tamsin, you still have those lights behind you?" "Negative. They disappeared about 2 minutes ago. Road's empty behind me now." Something about that detail bothered Asa more than he wanted to admit. A vehicle maintaining steady distance for miles, then vanishing right as they encountered an unexpected detour. The logical part of his mind suggested the other driver had simply turned off somewhere. But the instinctive part, the part honed by thousands of hours alone on dark highways, was sending warning signals he couldn't quite interpret. "I don't like this," Myron announced. "Construction signs can be moved, and this stretch shouldn't need work. It was repaved 2 years ago." "So what's the call?" Asa asked, bringing his truck to a complete stop about 50 feet behind Myron's taillights. Myron was quiet for a long moment, and Asa could imagine him weighing options. Ignore the detour and risk encountering an actual road closure ahead, or follow the marked route and trust that it was legitimate. The problem was, out here in the absolute middle of nowhere with no cell service and limited radio range, they were completely isolated. If this was some kind of setup, a hijacking attempt using fake road signs to funnel trucks onto remote side roads, they would have no way to call for help. "We follow it," Myron finally decided. "But stay tight and keep your eyes open for anything unusual. If this starts looking wrong, we stop and reassess." The detour road was paved, which was a good sign. It curved away from Highway 6 into a shallow valley, the headlights of the convoy creating a bizarre procession of light and shadow through the undeveloped landscape. The road surface was rougher than the main highway, with occasional potholes and degraded edges, but it was clearly a legitimate county road, not some hastily prepared trap. For the first 3 miles, nothing seemed amiss. The road wound through typical desert terrain, climbing gradually as it presumably arced around whatever obstruction was blocking the main highway. Then, at approximately 1:51 a.m., they drove into the fog. It appeared with shocking suddenness, a wall of dense white vapor that engulfed the lead truck so completely that Myron's taillights became diffuse red halos barely visible from Asa's position. Desert fog wasn't unheard of, particularly in valleys where temperature inversions could trap moisture, but the density and abruptness of this bank was unusual. "Visibility just went to hell," Myron reported, his voice tense. "Slowing to 30. Stay back and watch your spacing." Asa reduced speed as his own truck entered the fog bank. The world outside his windshield transformed into a featureless white void, his headlights reflecting back at him with useless intensity. He switched to fog lights, which helped marginally, but navigation became a matter of following the faint glow of Myron's taillights and praying the road didn't throw any sharp curves. "This is bad." Tamsin's voice came through, higher pitched with barely suppressed panic. "I can barely see the truck in front of me." Just maintain steady speed and don't overcorrect, Myron instructed, his own unease bleeding through despite his attempt at calm authority. This valley probably traps moisture. We'll climb out of it soon. But they didn't climb out of it. For the next 6 minutes, they crawled through the oppressive fog, their convoy reduced to a slow-motion procession of vehicles, trusting that the road ahead wouldn't suddenly end or turn sharply. Asa's hands were cramped on the steering wheel, his eyes straining to process the minimal visual information available. Then, as abruptly as it had appeared, the fog ended. One moment, Asa was driving blind through white murk. The next, he was in clear air again, the stars visible overhead, and Myron's truck clearly visible ahead. The transition was so sudden that it took a moment for his brain to adjust, to accept that visibility had returned. "Everyone still with me?" Myron called out. "Here," Asa confirmed, flexing his tense shoulders. Silence on the radio. "Tamsin, report status," Myron commanded, an edge of concern sharpening his voice. More silence. Asa checked his mirrors, expecting to see Tamsin's headlights emerging from the fog bank behind him. The road behind his truck was empty, just the fog wall, about 200 feet back, glowing slightly in his taillight's reflection. No headlights. No truck. "Myron, I'm not seeing her," Asa reported, a cold weight settling in his stomach. "She's not behind me." "What do you mean, she's not behind you?" Myron's truck was already slowing, its brake lights flaring. "She was right there. We've been in radio contact the whole time. I'm telling you, there's nothing behind me. Just fog." Both trucks came to a complete stop, hazard lights activating. Asa watched his mirror intently, expecting at any moment to see Tamsin's headlights materialize from the fog bank. 30 seconds passed, a minute, 2 minutes. "Tamsin, if you can hear this, respond immediately," Myron broadcast, his professional calm fracturing. "Tamsin Quinn, respond." The radio offered only static in reply. "I'm turning around," Asa announced, already checking for space to maneuver his truck. "She could be stuck back there, maybe mechanical failure and her radio died." "Negative, stay put," Myron ordered. "You turn that rig around on this narrow road in the dark, you'll end up in the ditch. I'm walking back. You keep trying to raise her on the radio." Asa watched in his mirror as Myron's driver door opened, the interior light briefly silhouetting the older man's frame before he dropped to the pavement. Myron had a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness as he walked past Asa's truck towards the fog bank. "Anything?" Myron called out when he was about halfway to the fog. "Nothing on the radio," Asa confirmed, his hand repeatedly keying the CB microphone. "Tamsin, this is the convoy. Please respond if you can hear this. Tamsin Quinn, respond." Myron reached the edge of the fog bank and paused, his flashlight beam penetrating a few feet into the murk before diffusing into uselessness. He stood there for a long moment, clearly weighing the wisdom of walking blind into the fog. "I'm going in about 50 feet, Myron finally announced. "If she's just on the other side with dead electronics, I'll find her. You keep that radio hot." Asa watched as Myron's flashlight beam disappeared into the white vapor. He could track the older man's progress for perhaps 30 feet before the fog completely swallowed the light. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one ratcheting up Asa's anxiety another notch. 4 minutes and 17 seconds after Myron entered the fog, his voice crackled back through the CB. "I'm coming back out. Can't see anything in there, and I'm not walking blind into deeper fog." Myron emerged from the white wall looking spooked, his weathered face pale in the reflected light. He walked quickly back to Asa's truck, and Asa rolled down his window. "This doesn't make sense," Myron said, slightly out of breath. "She was right there. We all went through that fog bank together. There's no side roads. No way she could have turned off. Could she have stopped inside the fog? Pulled over because she couldn't see? Maybe, but then where's her truck? I walked far enough back that I should have seen lights or heard an engine. They stared at each other, both reluctant to voice the obvious question. How does a 70-foot tractor-trailer simply vanish from the middle of a 3-truck convoy? We need to get help, Asa said. State police, search and rescue, someone with real equipment who can search properly. Agreed, but we've got no cell service, and this detour road doesn't have mile markers. We don't even know exactly where we are. Asa grabbed his GPS unit from the dash. I've got coordinates. Let me write them down, and we can try to reach someone once we get back to the main highway. As Asa scribbled the numbers onto a piece of paper, Myron walked back toward the fog bank one more time, his flashlight beam sweeping back and forth as if hoping to conjure Tamsin's missing truck into existence through sheer force of will. Come on, Myron muttered, his voice barely carrying to where Asa sat. Where the hell did you go? The desert night offered no answers, just the whisper of wind across ancient rock and the distant howl of a coyote echoing through the darkness. The decision to continue forward rather than backward was pragmatic, but felt wrong. Myron and Asa stood in the darkness between their 2 trucks, the fog bank glowing softly behind them like a curtain, concealing a stage where something inexplicable had just occurred. If we drive back through that fog, Myron reasoned, his flashlight beam cutting nervous patterns across the pavement, we risk running into whatever situation she's in. We could make it worse, cause an accident ourselves. Better to get to the main highway, get a signal, get proper help out here. Asa wanted to argue, wanted to insist they turn around and search methodically no matter how long it took. But the logic was sound. 2 truckers stumbling around in impenetrable fog in the middle of the night weren't going to accomplish anything except potentially creating more victims. Professional search and rescue, with proper equipment and training, was the right call. How far to the main highway? Asa asked, though he suspected neither of them really knew. Detour sign said 12 miles. We've gone maybe 7, so another 5 to rejoin Highway 6, then maybe 15 more to the next town with cell service. Myron paused, his jaw working as he calculated. 40 minutes if we push the speed limit. They climbed back into their respective trucks and began moving again, but the dynamic of the convoy had fundamentally changed. What had been a routine freight haul with casual camaraderie had transformed into something darker. The desert landscape, which moments before had seemed merely empty, now felt actively hostile, as if the darkness concealed watching eyes and malevolent intent. Asa kept his CB radio active, periodically calling out for Tamsin even though he knew it was futile. The static in response felt like mockery. His eyes flicked constantly between the road ahead and his mirrors, half expecting to see Tamsin's headlights suddenly reappear, the whole incident revealed as some bizarre but explainable confusion. The detour road continued its winding path through the valley, and after approximately 4 miles, they saw the first sign indicating Highway 6 was 2 miles ahead. Both drivers felt a surge of relief. Get back to the main highway, find a town, get help. Simple steps they could focus on instead of dwelling on the impossible thing that had just happened. At 2:17 a.m., they rejoined Highway 6. The transition was marked by newer pavement and the familiar sight of highway mile markers reflecting in their headlights. Myron immediately picked up speed, pushing his truck toward 70 miles per hour, eager to reach help. First town should be Preston's Junction, Myron announced over the CB. Gas station, truck stop, definitely cell service, 22 miles. But even as he said it, something felt off about the highway. Asa couldn't immediately identify what was bothering him, just a nagging sense that something wasn't quite right. The road looked the same, felt the same, but, Myron, check your mile markers. Asa said slowly, his eyes fixed on a green reflective post that had just passed on the right side of the road. What about them? Just look at the next one and tell me the number. A minute passed before Myron responded, and when he did, his voice carried a note of confusion. Mile marker 183. Why? Because before the detour, right before that construction sign, we were at mile marker 167. The detour was supposed to be 12 miles to rejoin the highway. There was a long silence as both drivers processed the arithmetic. If they'd gone 7 miles on the detour road, then rejoined Highway 6 and driven another couple miles, they should be at approximately mile marker 176, maybe 178 at most. Mile marker 183 meant they'd somehow covered an extra 10 to 15 miles without accounting for them. GPS must have glitched during the fog, Myron said, but there was no conviction in his voice. These valleys play hell with satellite signals. Asa checked his own GPS unit. It showed their current position as mile marker 183 on Highway 6, exactly matching the roadside markers. The device's trip log, however, showed something disturbing. There was a gap in the recorded route, a 23-minute period where the GPS had apparently lost signal and recorded no movement data at all. 23 minutes during which, according to their memory and the timestamps on their dashboard clocks, they'd been continuously driving. Myron, how long do you show between leaving Highway 6 for the detour and rejoining it? Another pause, then dashboard clock shows about 48 minutes total. Why? Same here. But my GPS log shows a 23-minute gap where it wasn't recording, and we're 15 miles further along than we should be. That doesn't... Myron trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. The implications were difficult to process. If the GPS was accurate about the gap, then almost half their time on the detour road was somehow unaccounted for. And the extra distance suggested they'd traveled much farther than the simple loop around blocked construction should have required. Or it suggested something neither of them wanted to consider, that their perception of time and distance during that fog-shrouded drive had been fundamentally unreliable. Preston's Junction appeared ahead, a scatter of lights in the darkness that represented civilization and connectivity. Myron's truck signaled for the exit, and Asa followed him into a truck stop that looked like every other such facility across America. Islands of fluorescent light surrounded by vast parking areas where big rigs clustered like sleeping livestock. They parked side by side and met in the space between their trucks. The normal sounds of a truck stop at night. Idling engines, the hiss of air brakes, distant country music from someone's cab, felt almost surreal after the isolated strangeness of the past hour. "I'm calling state police first," Myron said, already pulling out his cell phone. "Then our dispatch. This needs to be reported right away." Asa nodded, watching, as Myron walked toward the well-lit truck stop building where cell signal would be strongest. He stayed with the vehicles, ostensibly to monitor their cargo, but really because he needed a moment to process what had happened. A truck doesn't just vanish. There had to be a rational explanation. A side road they'd missed in the fog, a mechanical failure that had caused Tamsin to stop and turn off her lights for some reason. Something. Myron was gone for 22 minutes. When he returned, his expression was troubled. State police are sending a unit, but the closest one is about 45 minutes out. They're also calling search and rescue, but... Myron hesitated, choosing his words carefully. The dispatcher sounded skeptical, said there've been no reports of any construction or detour signs on Highway 6. They checked with the county road department and the state DOT, and nobody authorized any closures. So what? The signs were fake? Someone set up a fake detour? That's what the police want to know. But why? Tamsin was hauling construction equipment, nothing particularly valuable. Our pharmaceutical cargo is worth money, but hijackers would need refrigeration facilities and black market contacts to fence it. It doesn't make sense as a robbery. Asa felt a chill despite the warm night air. So, what's the alternative? We all hallucinated the same detour, the same fog. I don't know. I just know that a woman and her truck are missing, and we were the last people with eyes on her. Myron's face was haggard in the artificial light. Dispatch is filing an incident report. We're supposed to wait here for the police to interview us, then they'll probably want us to lead them back to the location. They waited in the truck stop's 24-hour diner, drinking bitter coffee that neither of them wanted but that gave their hands something to do. Around them, other truckers came and went, oblivious to the tension radiating from the corner booth. The normalcy of the scene, drivers checking their phones, complaining about dispatchers, debating routes, made the events of the past hours feel even more surreal. At 3:41 a.m., a Nevada State Police trooper arrived. His name tag read Cordova, and he had the alert weariness of someone working graveyard shift in a region where nothing much happened until suddenly something very strange did. Trooper Cordova listened to their account without interrupting, taking notes on a small tablet. When they finished, he asked them to go through it again, this time with specific attention to exact times and landmarks. On the third telling, his questions became more pointed. So you're certain the third truck was behind you when you entered the fog? Positive, Myron confirmed. She'd been calling out her status on the CB regularly. Last transmission was maybe 30 seconds before we hit the fog bank. And the fog, describe it again. Dense, unnaturally dense, Asa said. Like driving through cotton. Visibility maybe 20, 30 feet at most. How long were you in it? Felt like about 6 minutes, maybe 7. Cordova consulted his tablet. But your GPS shows that 23-minute gap. The GPS could be wrong, Myron offered, but without much hope. Maybe. Or maybe time perception gets distorted in low visibility, high-stress situations. Cordova looked between them. Here's what I need you to understand. This is serious, but it's probably explainable. Trucks break down, drivers get disoriented. She might have pulled over in the fog, had a medical emergency, a dozen things. But I need you to show me exactly where this happened. They drove in convoy back toward the detour location, Trooper Cordova's patrol car leading with Myron and Asa following in their trucks. The early morning darkness was beginning to soften slightly, the stars fading as the first hint of dawn approached from the east. Finding the detour road again proved more difficult than expected. They drove to the approximate location where the detour sign had directed them off Highway 6, but there was no sign. No construction markers, no evidence of recent road work. They drove another 5 miles in both directions, searching for any turnoff that matched their memory. Finally, Myron spotted a dirt road that looked vaguely familiar, though he couldn't say for certain it was the same route. Cordova drove down it slowly, his patrol car's spotlight sweeping the landscape. Myron and Asa followed in their trucks, though the narrow dirt track made for nerve-wracking maneuvering with such large vehicles. After approximately 2 miles, the dirt road simply ended at a locked gate, marking the boundary of what appeared to be a private ranch. Beyond the gate, tire tracks continued for perhaps another 100 feet before disappearing into virgin desert scrub. There was no fog, no pavement, no continuation of the detour route they clearly remembered driving. "This isn't it," Asa said with certainty, standing beside Cordova's car. "The detour was paved. This is just a ranch access road." Cordova played his flashlight beam across the gate and the area beyond. "There's no other turnoff between here and where you rejoin the highway. I drove this route twice looking." "Then we need to search a wider area," Myron insisted. "It has to be here somewhere." But as dawn continued to lighten the sky, revealing the stark desert landscape in increasing detail, the search became more frustrating. They drove the entire section of Highway 6 3 more times, checking every possible turnoff. None matched their memory. The paved detour road, the construction signs, the place where they'd driven into impenetrable fog, none of it could be found in the brightening morning light. At 6:15 a.m., Cordova called for additional units and a search helicopter. The official search for Tamsin Quinn and her missing truck expanded to cover a 50-square-mile area around the approximate location where Myron and Asa insisted they'd last seen her. The helicopter arrived at 7:42 a.m., and from the ground, Asa watched it make systematic sweeps across the desert basin. The pilot's voice occasionally crackled through Cordova's radio, reporting nothing, negative contact, still searching. "We're missing something obvious," Asa said to Myron as they stood beside their trucks on the shoulder of Highway 6. "You can't hide a semi-trailer in open desert. Even if she drove off-road somehow, there'd be tracks, disturbed vegetation, something." Myron didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the distant helicopter. His silence spoke volumes about what he was thinking, but didn't want to say. That maybe the truck wasn't in the desert at all. That maybe whatever had happened during those confused minutes in the fog had taken Tamsin and her vehicle somewhere they couldn't search because they couldn't conceptualize where it might be. The investigation into Tamsin Quinn's disappearance consumed the next 72 hours. Nevada State Police brought in additional resources, including a specialized unit that handled missing persons cases in rural areas. The FBI was notified due to the interstate nature of commercial trucking, and they sent 2 agents to interview Myron and Asa repeatedly, looking for inconsistencies or details that might crack the case open. Asa found himself in a conference room at the Nevada State Police headquarters in Carson City, going through his statement for what felt like the 20th time. The FBI agent across from him, a woman named Torres, had a talent for asking the same question in subtly different ways, searching for variations in his answers that might indicate deception or false memory. "Walk me through the radio communications one more time," Torres said, her pen poised over a legal pad. "Every transmission you remember from the moment you left the staging area to when you realized Ms. Quinn was missing." Asa closed his eyes, trying to reconstruct the evening in precise detail. Myron called for a convoy check at 11:47. All 3 of us responded, standard check-in. Then around 12:23 he mentioned a possible storm system but said it wouldn't reach us. After that, he paused, remembering something he'd forgotten to mention before. Tamsin said something odd, asked if anyone else had noticed something, but when Myron asked what, she said she thought she'd seen lights behind her. Lights from another vehicle. That's what she implied, but when she looked again, they were gone. She said it might have been a reflection. Torres made a note. And this was before the detour? Yeah, maybe 40 minutes before. The next significant communication was when we approached the detour sign, which no one else has been able to find. Asa opened his eyes, meeting Torres's steady gaze. "I know how it sounds. Believe me, I know. But we saw those signs. All 3 of us followed that detour. I drove on a paved road for miles, and then drove into fog so dense you couldn't see. Yes, Mr. Rutledge, I'm going to be direct with you. Every detail you and Mr. Keach have described has checked out. Your cargo manifests, your departure times, your GPS logs up until that 23-minute gap. You're experienced drivers with clean records, but the physical evidence to support your account of what happened simply doesn't exist. No detour signs, no paved detour road, no fog bank. The Weather Service has no record of fog in that area that night. Atmospheric conditions weren't conducive to fog formation. So you think we're lying? That we did something to Tamsin and concocted this story? I think something happened that you're interpreting in a certain way, and that interpretation might not align with the actual events. Torres leaned forward slightly. Human memory is unreliable, especially under stress. Darkness, fatigue, isolated roads, these create conditions where the brain fills in gaps, sometimes incorrectly. Is it possible you misremembered the sequence of events? That maybe Miss Quinn separated from the convoy earlier, and the detour was something else entirely? No, Asa said firmly. I know what I saw. I know what I drove through. But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at him. The lack of physical evidence was impossible to ignore. Could they have hallucinated the same false memories? Was there some environmental factor, some shared cognitive distortion that had made them perceive events differently than they'd actually occurred? The investigation took an unexpected turn on the fourth day when a highway maintenance worker came forward with information. The worker, whose route included the section of Highway 6 in question, reported finding something odd at approximately mile marker 167. Fresh marks on the pavement that looked like something heavy had recently been removed, along with several small pieces of torn reflective material consistent with road construction signs. State police forensics examined the site and confirmed the maintenance worker's observation. Something had been placed on the road, something with a substantial base that had left pressure marks on the asphalt. And the reflective material, when analyzed, matched the type used on official highway department signs. Someone set up fake detour signs, Cordova told Myron and Asa when he called them with the update. Place them temporarily, then remove them before morning. Question is why, and what happened to Ms. Quinn. Hijacking, Myron suggested immediately. Set up fake detour, funnel trucks onto a remote road, ambush them somehow. That's the working theory, Cordova agreed. But we still haven't found the detour road you described, and we can't figure out how they'd make a truck disappear so completely. We've had aircraft searching for days. A 70-foot trailer doesn't just vanish. The investigation broadened to include examination of Tamsin's background. What they found added another layer of strangeness to the case. Tamsin Quinn wasn't her real name. Her actual identity was Tamsin Driscoll, and she had a complicated past that included a messy divorce 2 years earlier and a restraining order against her ex-husband, whom she'd accused of stalking and harassment. The ex-husband, Gerald Driscoll, became an immediate person of interest. Police located him in Reno and brought him in for questioning, but his alibi was solid. He'd been working a security shift at a casino, with time-stamped entry and exit records, camera footage, and multiple witnesses confirming his presence during the entire time frame when Tamsin had disappeared. Her family says she'd been spooked lately, Torres told Asa during another interview. Thought someone was following her, watching her apartment. She'd changed her name, taken routes she'd never driven before, trying to stay unpredictable. Does that suggest anything to you? That maybe someone really was following her, Asa said. Those lights she mentioned seeing behind the convoy, maybe they weren't a reflection. Maybe someone had been tracking her, set up that fake detour specifically to separate her from us. That's elaborate, Torres noted. Would require knowledge of convoy routes, timing, and sophisticated planning. Not impossible, but unusual for personal grudge crimes. The case began to generate media attention. News outlets picked up on the mysterious elements. The vanishing truck, the detour that couldn't be found, the time gap in GPS records. Speculation ranged from the mundane, simple criminal hijacking, to the bizarre, with some online communities suggesting everything from alien abduction to interdimensional portals. Asa tried to ignore the media circus and return to work, but his employer was hesitant to assign him new routes. The implied suspicion was clear. Until the Quinn case was resolved, he was a liability. Myron faced a similar treatment, and the two drivers found themselves in a strange limbo, neither cleared nor charged, but effectively sidelined. I keep going over it in my head, Myron told Asa during a phone call 2 weeks after the incident, trying to find what I missed, what I should have noticed. Those lights Tamsin mentioned, I brushed them off. But what if someone really was following her? What if the whole detour was designed to isolate her, get her away from witnesses? Then where's the truck? Asa asked. That's what I can't get past. Even if someone hijacked her, killed her, God forbid, they'd still have to hide a massive vehicle. And we were right there. How'd they do it without us seeing anything? That fog, Myron said slowly. I've driven through a lot of desert weather, and I've never encountered anything like that. It wasn't normal, Asa. The way it just appeared, solid as a wall, and then vanished. What if it wasn't fog at all? What if it was something else, something designed to blind us while they took her? Designed by who and how? I don't know. I just know that something happened in those minutes we can't account for. That GPS gap, the missing distance, we're missing a chunk of time and we don't even know it's missing. The breakthrough came 5 weeks after Tamsin's disappearance, and it came from an unexpected source. A security camera at a gas station 180 miles away from where she'd vanished. The camera had captured footage of a truck matching Tamsin's description pulling in at 3:47 a.m. on the morning of her disappearance. Police obtained the footage and confirmed. It was definitely Tamsin's truck, identifiable by specific decals and minor damage to the front bumper. But it was being driven by someone else, a figure in a dark jacket and baseball cap whose face was carefully angled away from the camera. The truck refueled, then departed eastbound, heading deeper into Nevada's remote interior. So, she was taken, Asa said, when Cordova showed him the footage. Someone else is driving her truck. Where did this gas station footage come from? Place called Starline Station, off Highway 50, Cordova replied. Middle of nowhere. One of those old-school stops that serves maybe a dozen customers a day. Manager said he'd meant to turn over the footage weeks ago, but forgot. 180 miles from where we were, in less than 2 hours? Asa shook his head. That's not possible. Not on these roads. We know. Which brings us back to that time gap you and Myron both experienced. Maybe it wasn't minutes, maybe it was longer than you thought. So what, we lost hours of memory? Or the drugs you were both slipped affected your perception of time? Asa stared at him. Drugged? We were never out of our trucks except when Myron walked into the fog looking for her. The coffee at the staging area, the water bottles, could have been tampered with before you arrived. Something that wouldn't fully take effect until you were on the road. Something that would make you suggestible to hallucination or false memory, while still able to operate your vehicles semi-normally. It was a theory that answered some questions while raising others. If they'd been drugged, it would explain the cognitive distortion, the missing time, the inability to find the detour road. But it didn't explain who had drugged them, or how the hijackers had known to set up the fake detour at exactly the right location. The case remained open, but growing colder by the day. Police tracked Tamsin's truck using the gas station sighting as a starting point, checking cameras at other locations along Highway 50 and its connecting routes. They found 2 more brief sightings, once at a rural intersection, then again near an abandoned mining complex. After that, nothing. The truck vanished again, this time apparently for good. Tamsin Quinn's family held a memorial service 6 months after her disappearance. Myron attended. Asa sent flowers but couldn't bring himself to face her relatives. The guilt was overwhelming, the knowledge that he'd been right there, so close, and had still failed to protect her, or even to understand what was happening until it was too late. 9 months after Tamsin's disappearance, Asa was finally cleared for active duty by his employer, though with the caveat that he'd be assigned to routes with higher traffic and better cellular coverage. They didn't say it explicitly, but the message was clear. No more lonely desert highways where strange things could happen beyond the reach of help or explanation. He'd just finished a routine delivery to Sacramento when his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but local to Nevada. "Mr. Rutledge, this is Detective Torres, FBI. Do you have a few minutes?" Asa pulled into a truck stop parking lot, his heart rate accelerating. "Did you find her?" "Find the truck?" In a manner of speaking. "We found the truck, or what's left of it. A rancher in eastern Nevada reported an abandoned trailer on his property. It's been sitting there for months, maybe longer. We've confirmed it's Tamsin Quinn's trailer based on the van. And Tamsin..." A pause. No sign of her. The trailer had been stripped of cargo, identification removed, but we matched it through database records. Here's the interesting part. The location where it was found? It's approximately 40 miles north of Highway 6, accessible only by rough dirt roads. Middle of nowhere, no reason for anyone to go there unless they wanted to hide something. "That doesn't make sense," Asa said. "How would they have gotten it there? A truck that size on dirt roads, it would have been noticed, would have left obvious tracks. There are tracks, but they're old, degraded by weather. Our analysis suggests the trailer's been there at least 6 months, possibly longer, which creates a timeline problem, because the gas station footage showed her truck being driven 2 days after her disappearance. So, someone separated the cab from the trailer, Asa reasoned. Drove the cab with whoever took her, dumped the trailer. That's the logical conclusion. But here's what's bothering me. The trailer still has its refrigeration unit attached. Those units are valuable, could have been sold easily. Why leave it? Why leave the trailer at all instead of selling the whole thing? Because they weren't after the cargo or the vehicle, Asa said slowly, working it through. They were after Tamsin. The hijacking was personal, not financial. That's our thinking. We've reopened the investigation into her ex-husband despite his alibi. If he hired someone, planned this carefully, he could have been establishing that alibi while others carried out the actual crime. Have you searched the area around where the trailer was found? If they dumped the trailer there, maybe they dumped her body nearby. Yes, we've searched. Cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, the works. Nothing so far, but it's a lot of territory to cover. After the call ended, Asa sat in his truck, staring at nothing. The knowledge that Tamsin's trailer had been found should have felt like progress, but instead it just made the whole situation feel darker. Someone had carefully planned her abduction, had gone to elaborate lengths including setting up fake detours and apparently drugging 2 witnesses, all for the purpose of making one woman vanish. And they'd succeeded. Despite the investigation, the searches, the media attention, Tamsin Quinn remained missing. Whether she was alive or dead, whether she'd been trafficked or murdered, no one knew. She'd simply ceased to exist on that foggy desert night, leaving behind only questions and guilt. Asa tried to return to his normal routine, but the experience had changed him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. He found himself hypervigilant on the road, checking mirrors obsessively, questioning every unusual circumstance. He refused night routes when possible. He never drove alone through remote areas without maintaining constant radio contact with dispatch. Myron had been affected even more severely. He'd retired from trucking entirely, selling his rig and taking a dispatcher job that kept him in an office. When Asa called to check on him periodically, Myron always sounded hollowed out, haunted by the conviction that he'd failed in some fundamental way to protect someone under his Convoy leadership. "I should have turned around immediately," Myron told Asa during one of these calls. "The second she didn't answer the radio, I should have gone back. Protocol be damned. Instead, I walked into that fog and came back empty-handed like an idiot. You did what anyone would have done, Asa assured him, though he felt the same guilt. There was no way to know what was happening. That's just it. I think part of me did know. Something felt wrong from the start, from when she first mentioned those lights behind her, but I brushed it off because it was easier than confronting the possibility that we were driving into danger. The case generated various theories in trucking communities and online forums. Some believed it was a sophisticated human trafficking operation that used elaborate methods to capture victims. Others thought it was connected to organized crime, possibly retribution for something in Tamsin's past that hadn't been uncovered. A few speculated about law enforcement corruption, suggesting that the person in official-looking uniform that Tamsin had trusted enough to follow might have actually been a rogue cop. Then, 14 months after her disappearance, a hiker in the remote Nevada wilderness made a discovery that shifted the entire case in a new direction. In a narrow canyon approximately 60 miles from where the trailer had been found, the hiker encountered what appeared to be a makeshift campsite. Among the scattered debris, food wrappers, a torn tarp, rusted cans, was a driver's license belonging to Tamsin Quinn. Police searched the area extensively and found more personal effects: articles of clothing, a watch that Tamsin's sister identified as a birthday gift she'd given her, and most chilling of all, a small notebook containing handwritten entries that appeared to be some kind of diary or captivity log. The entries were sporadic and sometimes incoherent, but they painted a picture of someone who'd been held against their will in an isolated location. The handwriting was confirmed to be Tamsin's. The dates were impossible to verify since the entries were labeled with day numbers rather than actual calendar dates. But forensic analysis of the paper and ink suggested they'd been written around the time of her disappearance. The final entry read simply, "They're moving me again. Can't let them take me where there's no coming back." But despite the discovery, Tamsin herself remained unfound. The canyon yielded no human remains, no definitive evidence of her fate. The campsite appeared to have been abandoned months earlier, with weather exposure degrading whatever other clues it might once have contained. Detective Torres called Asa with the update. The diary entries suggest she was held somewhere remote, moved periodically. She was alive for at least several weeks after the abduction. Beyond that, we can't say for certain. Do the entries mention who took her? Any details about the people holding her? Nothing specific. She refers to them and they, but never uses names. There are references to being transported in darkness, to multiple locations, to being given food but rarely spoken to. It reads like someone in survival mode trying to document their situation in case someone eventually found it. So she knew she might not make it out. Or she wanted to leave a record in case she did escape and needed evidence. We're working on establishing a timeline based on the entries. If we can figure out when she wrote what, we might be able to narrow down locations, find where else she was held. But as the investigation ground forward, Asa couldn't shake the feeling that they were chasing shadows. Whoever had taken Tamsin had planned meticulously, executed flawlessly, and left just enough traces to torment investigators without providing anything actionable. The fake detour, the drugging, the fog that might not have been fog, all of it suggested resources and sophistication beyond a simple crime of passion. 2 years after the disappearance, the case remained officially open but had gone cold. No new leads emerged, no remains were discovered. Tamsin Quinn existed in that terrible limbo of being neither confirmed dead nor alive, just absent. Asa still drove, though he'd never returned to Highway 6. He'd hear stories occasionally from other drivers, rumors of strange detours that appeared and disappeared, of mysterious fog banks on clear nights, of vehicles that seemed to follow convoys before vanishing. Most of it was probably urban legend, the trucking community's way of processing an inexplicable tragedy. But sometimes, alone on a dark highway, Asa wondered. On the 3-year anniversary of the disappearance, Myron called him. "I went back," he said without preamble. "Drove out to Highway 6, to the approximate spot where we last saw her. Just wanted to see it in daylight, see if I could make sense of it." "And did you?" "No, it's just highway, just desert. Nothing remarkable about it at all, but I found something." Myron's voice dropped. "There's a pullout about a mile past where I think we came back to the highway. Someone had left something there, a small wooden cross, the kind people put up for car accident victims. It had her name on it. Tamsin Quinn, lost but not forgotten. Her family? I called her sister. She said they didn't put it there, didn't know anything about it. So, who did?" Asa had no answer. Perhaps another driver who'd known Tamsin, or someone who'd followed the case and wanted to mark the spot. Or perhaps, and this was the thought that kept him awake that night, perhaps Tamsin herself had left it. Proof that she'd survived, escaped, but couldn't or wouldn't reveal herself. The case of the vanishing convoy truck had no satisfying resolution, no moment of clarity where all the pieces fell into place. It remained what it had always been, a collection of impossible events, unexplainable circumstances, and a woman who'd driven into fog one night and never driven out. Asa eventually sold his truck and retired early, taking a job training new drivers. When he taught them about safety protocols and convoy procedures, he always included the story of Tamsin Quinn, though he left out the strangest details. He focused on the actionable lessons. Maintain constant communication. Verify road closures through official channels. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. But sometimes, when a student asked what had ultimately happened to the missing driver, Asa would pause before answering. "We don't know," he'd say finally. And that's perhaps the most important lesson of all, that out there on those lonely highways, there are things that happen which defy explanation. Situations where doing everything right still isn't enough. All you can do is stay alert, stay connected, and hope that whatever happened to her never happens to you. At night, when sleep evaded him, Asa would sometimes pull up the old GPS log from that night, staring at the 23-minute gap where his device had recorded nothing. 23 minutes during which they'd driven through fog, followed a detour that couldn't be found, and lost a member of their convoy to forces they still didn't understand. 23 minutes that had stretched somehow to cover 48 minutes of dashboard clock time and 15 miles of extra highway distance. 23 minutes in which the ordinary physics of time and space seemed to have bent, allowing something impossible to occur. And somewhere in that gap, in that fold in reality, Tamsin Quinn had vanished, leaving behind only questions and the fading hope that someday, somehow, an answer would emerge from the darkness that had swallowed her whole. The Missouri River cuts through Montana like a surgeon's scar, ancient and purposeful. The bridges that span it are engineering marvels born of necessity, connecting isolated communities across water that runs too deep and fast for casual crossing. The Garrison Bridge, specifically, had served truckers and travelers for 43 years, its steel trusses and concrete pylons enduring spring floods and winter ice with stoic reliability. Garland Poe had crossed the Garrison Bridge perhaps 200 times in his 18-year career, hauling freight across the northern plains. At 51, he knew every approach, every expansion joint's rhythmic thump, every wind pattern that could catch a high-profile load and make the crossing momentarily exciting. What he didn't know, as he approached the bridge on a cool September evening in 2019, was that this crossing would be different from all the others in ways that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The run had started normally enough. Poe was hauling manufactured steel components from Billings to Great Falls, a straightforward 4-hour drive along Highway 87. His rig was a well-maintained Kenworth, the kind of reliable workhorse that didn't generate excitement but got the job done day after day. He'd departed Billings at 3:30 p.m., putting him on track to reach Great Falls well before the receiving dock closed at 8 o'clock p.m. At approximately 6:15 p.m., as he approached the 20-mile stretch before the Garrison Bridge, his CB radio crackled with an incoming transmission. The voice was unfamiliar, tinged with static but intelligible. "Southbound traffic approaching Garrison Bridge. This is Convoy Formation Charlie 7-3. We're northbound, 4 vehicles, requesting courtesy spacing for bridge crossing. Over." Poe thumbed his microphone. "This is southbound Solo, Kenworth hauling steel. Copy your request, Charlie 7-3. I'll hold back and let you clear the bridge first. Over." "Much appreciated, southbound. We're about 12 miles out from the north approach. Should have visual in about 10 minutes. Over." Convoy formations weren't unusual on these routes. Companies sometimes grouped trucks for efficiency or mutual support, particularly for overnight runs through isolated territory. 4 trucks traveling together meant Poe would need to wait perhaps 3 or 4 minutes for them to cross the single-lane bridge section, a minor delay that was standard courtesy among professional drivers. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the scattered clouds in shades of amber and rose. The landscape along this stretch was quintessential Montana, rolling grassland punctuated by weathered fence posts, distant ranch buildings, and the occasional cluster of cottonwood trees marking hidden water sources. Traffic was sparse, as it usually was on Highway 87 during weekday evenings. As Poe crested a gentle rise, the Garrison Bridge came into view about 8 miles ahead. The structure was distinctive, its steel truss design creating a geometric pattern against the sky. From this distance, he could see the river glinting in the late afternoon light, and beyond the bridge, the road climbing up the far bank toward Great Falls. At 6:27 p.m., Poe spotted the northbound convoy approaching from the opposite direction. They were still several miles from the bridge, but their running lights were clearly visible in the growing dusk. He counted the headlights. 1, 2, 3, 4. Charlie 7-3 had reported their numbers accurately. Poe reduced his speed, pulling into a designated waiting area about a quarter mile from the bridge's south approach. From here, he had a clear view of the crossing and could easily monitor the convoy's progress. He set his parking brake and reached for his thermos, planning to use the brief wait to stretch his legs and grab some coffee. The CB crackled again. "Southbound Kenworth, this is Charlie 7-3. We're approaching the north side now. Thanks for the courtesy. Should have you moving again in about 5 minutes. Over." "No problem at all," Poe responded. "Take your time. Be safe. Over." He climbed down from his cab, stretching muscles that had been seated for nearly 3 hours. The evening air was cool and carried the smell of river water and prairie grass. From his vantage point, he watched the lid truck of the northbound convoy begin its approach to the bridge. The convoy moved in tight formation, each truck maintaining perhaps 200 feet of spacing. Professional drivers, Poe noted with approval. They'd clearly done this before, knew the bridge's characteristics, and were navigating it with the kind of coordinated precision that comes from experience, or good communication, or both. The first truck entered the bridge proper, its lights creating moving shadows among the steel trusses. The second truck followed, then the third. Poe sipped his coffee, idly calculating that he'd probably resume his drive in about 2 minutes. The fourth and final truck was just beginning its approach when something caught Poe's attention. The light was changing oddly, or rather the shadows were behaving strangely. Poe couldn't immediately identify what was wrong, just that something about the visual geometry of the scene didn't quite match his expectations. The fourth truck's headlights seemed to flicker or distort as it entered the bridge, though that could have been atmospheric interference, or simply the complex interplay of light and metal structure. He blinked, refocusing his vision. The lead truck was already emerging on the south side of the bridge, its lights sweeping across the road as it began the gradual climb up the far bank. The second truck appeared moments later, maintaining its spacing. Then the third truck cleared the bridge, its taillights bright red in the deepening twilight. Poe waited for the fourth truck to emerge, and waited, and continued waiting. After approximately 15 seconds, with no sign of the fourth vehicle, Poe set down his coffee and walked closer to the bridge approach, shading his eyes against the glare of the setting sun. The three trucks that had already crossed were continuing north, their lights receding into the distance. But the bridge itself appeared empty. No headlights, no running lights, no vehicle of any kind was visible on the span. "Charlie 73, this is the southbound Kenworth," Poe transmitted, a note of confusion entering his voice. "I've got 3 of your vehicles on the north side, but I'm not seeing your fourth. Did they pull over on the bridge?" "Over." Static was the only response. Poe tried again. "Charlie 73, do you copy? Requesting status on your fourth vehicle. Over." More static, then fragments of what might have been a voice too distorted to understand. Poe adjusted his radio's squelch control, trying to filter the interference, but the clarity didn't improve. Concerned now, Poe returned to his truck and fired up the engine. Something wasn't right. A truck doesn't just vanish off a bridge. There had to be a mechanical failure, an accident, something that would explain why the fourth vehicle hadn't completed the crossing. He drove slowly toward the bridge, hazard lights flashing, prepared to stop if he encountered a disabled vehicle. As he entered the bridge proper, he reduced his speed to a crawl, scanning both sides for any sign of trouble. The structure had narrow shoulders, essentially just the width of the bridge deck with minimal clearance, so a broken-down truck would be immediately obvious. But the bridge was empty. No vehicles, no debris, no oil slicks or skid marks. Nothing to indicate that 4 trucks rather than 3 had just crossed moments earlier. Poe drove the entire length slowly, checking every visible inch of the structure. When he emerged on the north side, he pulled over and grabbed his CB microphone again. "This is the southbound Kenworth to any northbound traffic that just crossed Garrison Bridge. I'm trying to locate a fourth vehicle that was part of your convoy. Does anyone copy? Over." The response came almost immediately, but not from who Poe expected. A different voice, younger and confused. "Southbound Kenworth. This is the convoy lead. Not sure what you mean by fourth vehicle. We're a 3-truck convoy, always have been. Over." Poe felt a chill despite the warm cab. "Negative, convoy lead. I counted 4 sets of headlights approaching the bridge. 4 trucks entered. Only 3 emerged. Over." There was a long pause before the response came. The convoy lead's voice now edged with concern. "Southbound. We're showing 3 vehicles on our manifest. Lead truck, middle truck, tail truck. Nobody's missing from our formation. Are you seeing a 4th truck right now? Over." "Negative. I'm not seeing it now," Poe admitted, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. "But I definitely saw 4 vehicles approach and enter that bridge. Over." Another pause, then, "Stand by, southbound. We're pulling over to do a physical count." Poe waited, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. This didn't make sense. He'd seen 4 trucks, he'd counted them twice. Unless he'd miscounted. In the fading light, with shadows and glare, was it possible he'd seen a reflection or a ghost image that made 3 trucks look like 4? It seemed unlikely, but the alternative, that a truck had literally disappeared from the middle of a bridge, was impossible. The CB crackled back to life. "Southbound Kenworth, we've confirmed our count. 3 trucks, lead, middle, tail. We never had a 4th vehicle. Don't know what you saw, but it wasn't part of our convoy. Over." "Copy that," Poe said slowly. Thanks for checking. Sorry for the confusion. Over? He sat in his truck on the side of the road, trying to process what had just happened. The rational part of his mind insisted he'd made a counting error, but the part of his mind that had spent nearly 2 decades on the road, the part that had learned to trust his observations and instincts, was screaming that something was very wrong. After a few minutes, Poe put his truck in gear and continued north toward Great Falls. He arrived at the receiving dock at 7:42 p.m., 18 minutes ahead of schedule. The dock workers unloaded his cargo with their usual efficiency, joking about the Billings Broncos' latest loss and asking if he'd heard about the construction delays that were supposedly coming to Highway 87 next month. Poe participated in the small talk automatically, but his mind was elsewhere. Back at the Garrison Bridge, replaying those moments when he'd watched the convoy cross. He'd seen 4 trucks. He was certain of it. But if 3 had emerged, and 3 was the total convoy count, then what had he seen entering the bridge as the 4th vehicle? After finishing his delivery paperwork, Poe found a truck stop on the outskirts of Great Falls. He parked in a well-lit section of the lot, mechanically went through his post-drive routine of checking his rig, and then retreated to the truck stop's 24-hour diner. The coffee was bitter and overbrewed, but Poe barely noticed. He pulled out his phone and searched for news about the Garrison Bridge. Nothing recent appeared. No accidents, no construction notices, no reports of anything unusual. He expanded his search to include historical information about the bridge and found the typical engineering details, maintenance records, and one brief mention of a fatal accident from 1987 when a drunk driver had struck the bridge abutment during an ice storm. He was about to put his phone away when he noticed another customer at the counter, a woman in her mid-40s wearing a faded denim jacket with a truck stop logo. She had the weathered look of someone who'd spent years on the road, and when she caught Poe looking in her direction, she raised her coffee cup in a small salute. "Long haul?" she asked. "Just up from Billings," Poe replied. "You?" "Coming back from Spokane. Name's Odessa Vale, though that's probably more information than you wanted." Garland Poe. He hesitated, then added, "You drive this route regularly?" "Few times a month. Why?" Poe debated whether to share his experience, but something about Odessa's direct manner suggested she wouldn't immediately dismiss him as crazy. "You ever cross the Garrison Bridge and see anything unusual?" Odessa's expression shifted subtly, a guarded look replacing the casual friendliness. She glanced around the diner as if checking who might be listening, then slid off her stool and moved to Poe's booth without invitation. "What kind of unusual?" she asked quietly. "Vehicles that don't quite add up," Poe said carefully. "Numbers that don't match." Odessa studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "How many did you count going in versus coming out?" "4 in, 3 out." "And you're sure about that count? Not tired, not distracted?" "I'm sure." Odessa took a long sip of her coffee, her eyes distant. "You're not the first person to notice something off about that bridge. There's talk among drivers who've been working this region for a while. Most people dismiss it as fatigue or light tricks, but there's enough consistent reports that some of us pay attention." "Reports of what exactly?" "Discrepancies. Vehicles that seem to be there and then aren't. Strange radio interference right around the bridge crossing. Time distortions, thinking you crossed in 2 minutes when your dash clock shows 5, or vice versa." She paused. "I've got a friend, another driver, who swears she saw the same truck cross the bridge twice on the same night. Identical down to the dent in the front bumper. Said she passed it going south, watched it cross ahead of her, then, an hour later, saw the exact same truck, same dent, crossing again in the same direction." "That's impossible." "Yeah, well, so is 4 trucks becoming 3, but here we are." Odessa leaned back in the booth. Look, I'm not saying the bridge is haunted or there's some government conspiracy. I'm just saying there's something about that location that creates unusual experiences. Maybe it's electromagnetic interference from the river. Maybe it's some quirk of the local topology that affects perception. But enough drivers have noticed something that it's worth taking seriously. Poe absorbed this information, feeling simultaneously validated and more unsettled. Has anyone ever reported it officially? To highway patrol or bridge inspectors? Some have tried. Reports get filed, maybe someone comes out and looks around, finds nothing unusual, case closed. The bridge is structurally sound. All the inspections pass, so what's there to investigate? Can't exactly demand answers about reality behaving strangely. But someone must keep records. If there are consistent reports, there's a guy, Odessa said slowly, as if deciding whether to share this information. Finch Abernathy. Used to be a trucker. Now he sort of drifts around. Shows up at truck stops and roadhouses. Collects stories about weird occurrences on the highways. Started doing it after he had his own experience on some back road in Wyoming. If anyone's keeping track of Garrison Bridge reports, it'd be him. Where can I find him? Can't really find Finch. He sort of finds you if he thinks you've got a story worth hearing. But he frequents a place called the Steel Horse Roadhouse about 60 miles west of here. Small place, mostly locals and truckers who know about it. Not exactly on the map, if you know what I mean. Poe made a note of the name. Thanks for talking. I was starting to think I'd imagined the whole thing. You didn't imagine it, Odessa said firmly. Whatever you saw, whatever happened at that bridge, it was real to you. That's what matters. The question isn't whether it happened. It's what it means, and why it keeps happening to different people. The Steel Horse Roadhouse sat at the junction of two county roads that most GPS systems didn't acknowledge existed. It was the kind of establishment that survived on word of mouth and returning customers who knew that the coffee was always fresh. The cook never asked questions, and the owner, Odessa Vale's cousin apparently, maintained a strict policy of minding one's own business. Poe found the place 3 days after his Garrison Bridge experience, following Odessa's directions and the vague markers she'd described: an abandoned grain elevator, a faded billboard advertising a long-defunct tourist attraction, and finally a gravel road that led to a low-slung building with a neon sign proclaiming Steel Horse in letters that had seen better decades. Inside, the roadhouse had the comfortable, worn quality of a place that had hosted thousands of conversations and absorbed countless stories. The walls were covered with trucking memorabilia, old license plates, faded photographs of classic rigs, and hand-drawn maps marking various routes across the northwestern states. A dozen tables were scattered across the main room, about half of them occupied by customers who looked like they'd been there for hours and might be there for several more. Poe ordered coffee at the bar and settled into a corner booth where he could observe the room. If Finch Abernathy was here, Poe had no idea what he looked like or how to identify him. Odessa had described him as weathered, probably late 50s, with the look of someone who sees more than most people, which could have applied to half the room's occupants. He'd been nursing his coffee for about 20 minutes when a man slid into the booth across from him without invitation. The man was indeed weathered, his face lined and tanned from decades of sun exposure. His eyes were an unusual pale gray, and they studied Poe with the kind of intensity that suggested he was cataloging details for future reference. "You're the Garrison Bridge driver," the man said. It wasn't a question. "How did you—" Odessa called ahead, said you had an experience worth documenting. "I'm Finch Abernathy." He extended a hand, which Poe shook. "Tell me what you saw and don't leave anything out. The details matter, even the ones that seem trivial." Over the next 45 minutes, Poe recounted the entire incident. Finch listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes in a worn leather journal. When Poe finished, Finch was quiet for a long moment, his finger tracing patterns on the table as if working through some complex equation. 4 in, 3 out, Finch finally said. And the convoy insisted they'd always been 3 trucks, never 4. Exactly. Did you happen to note the time? Specific minutes, I mean. Poe pulled out his phone and checked his log notes. I arrived at the waiting area at 6:27 p.m. The convoy completed their crossing by 6:32 p.m., based on when I started moving again. 5 minutes. Standard crossing time for a multi-vehicle convoy. Finch made another note. Did you experience any unusual radio interference? Static patterns, voice distortions, that kind of thing? Now that you mention it, yes. When I tried to contact the convoy, after noticing the missing truck, the radio was unusually staticky, and when I finally got through to the convoy lead, there was this odd echo quality to their voice. Finch's expression sharpened. Echo. That's interesting. Several other reports mention echo effects in communications near the bridge. He flipped back through his journal, scanning previous entries. 5 reports over the past 7 years of similar discrepancies, always involving convoys or multiple vehicles crossing together, always with the count being different on one side versus the other. Always fewer vehicles emerging than entered, Poe asked. Not always. One report, from about 4 years ago, described the opposite. A solo driver swore he crossed alone but saw 2 trucks emerge on the far side. His own, and an identical one that pulled away and disappeared within seconds. Finch looked up from his journal. Whatever's happening at that bridge, it's not consistent in direction. Sometimes vehicles vanish, sometimes they duplicate. Sometimes the count just doesn't add up in ways that defy logical explanation. But what could cause something like that? Electromagnetic interference, like Odessa suggested? Maybe, but that wouldn't explain the physical disappearance of a vehicle. EM interference might affect electronics, perception, even potentially create hallucinations. But multiple people seeing the same vehicle, counting it, and then having it not exist on the other side? Finch shook his head. That suggests something more fundamental is occurring. Something more fundamental like what? Finch hesitated, choosing his words carefully. The Garrison Bridge crosses one of the deepest sections of the Missouri River in this region. The bridge itself is built on bedrock formations that have some unusual geological properties. High iron content, magnetic anomalies that occasionally interfere with compass readings. Below the bridge, the riverbed has a depression, almost like a trench, where the water flow creates complex currents. Some people think that combination of factors, moving water, magnetic rock, specific bridge engineering, creates a kind of weak point. Weak point in what? In normal causality, in the expected flow of reality. Finch must have seen the skepticism in Poe's face because he held up a hand. I know how it sounds. Believe me, I spent years dismissing reports like yours as driver fatigue or mass hallucination. But the consistency of the reports, the specific details that recur across unrelated witnesses, the fact that it's location-specific. Something is happening at that bridge that doesn't fit normal explanations. Poe wanted to argue, to demand more rational theories, but he couldn't deny what he'd experienced. So, what do we do about it? Report it to someone who might investigate. To who? Highway Patrol will check the bridge structure, find nothing wrong, and close the case. Scientists would dismiss it as anecdotal evidence. The only people who take it seriously are the ones who've experienced it themselves. So, we just accept that there's a bridge where reality occasionally malfunctions. We document it, Finch corrected. We collect data, look for patterns, try to understand the conditions that make it happen. That's what I've been doing for 8 years now, traveling around, talking to drivers who've had unusual experiences, mapping the locations where strange things occur. He pulled out a larger map from his jacket, unfolding it across the table. The map showed Montana and surrounding states, with dozens of locations marked in different colored ink. Each mark represents a location where multiple witnesses have reported anomalous events. Time distortions, vehicle disappearances, navigation impossibilities. The Garrison Bridge is one of 12 such locations in Montana alone. Poe studied the map, noting that many of the marked locations were bridges, though some were isolated stretches of highway, mountain passes, or seemingly random rural intersections. Is there a pattern? Geographic or geological? Some commonalities. Many involve water crossings or areas with unusual geological formations. Some are near old mining sites or locations with documented magnetic anomalies. But the pattern isn't consistent enough to make predictions. The best I can say is that certain locations seem prone to these events, and drivers who are aware of them report experiencing fewer surprises. Because awareness somehow protects them? Maybe. Or maybe they just process the experiences differently, with less cognitive dissonance. The mind doesn't like things that don't make sense, so it works hard to rationalize or dismiss them. If you're already open to the possibility that something strange might occur, you're better equipped to observe and remember accurately. Poe absorbed this, his rational mind still struggling with the implications. What about the vehicle that disappeared? If it went somewhere else, is it possible someone could find it, track it down? Finch's expression darkened. That's the difficult part. When vehicles disappear at these locations, they don't seem to reappear anywhere we can access. I've investigated 3 cases extensively, including checking with law enforcement databases, salvage yards, insurance records. The vehicles simply cease to exist in our observable reality. And the drivers? In 2 cases, the trucks were apparently empty. Solo drivers who vanished along with their vehicles. Never found, never heard from again. The 3rd case, the truck was found about 6 months later, abandoned in a field approximately 90 miles from where it disappeared. No driver, no cargo, and the vehicle's odometer showed an extra 2,000 miles that couldn't be accounted for. A chill ran through Poe, despite the warm roadhouse. So, people can just disappear? It's rare. Most of the time, the anomalies are just observational. You see something weird, but you continue on unaffected. But yes, there have been cases where the consequences were more severe. Finch closed his journal. That's why I document these events. Not to sensationalize or scare people, but to create a record. So, if someone does go missing, there's at least some context for what might have happened. Has anyone ever tried to deliberately trigger one of these events, to study it under controlled conditions? A few people have tried, never works. The anomalies don't seem to occur on demand. They're spontaneous, unpredictable. You can cross the Garrison Bridge 100 times with no incident. Then, on the 101st time, reality hiccups. Finch stood up, pocketing his journal. My advice? Note what you saw. Remember it accurately, but don't obsess over it. Continue your normal routes, but stay alert. If you cross the Garrison Bridge again and experience something similar, document it immediately. Times, conditions, specific details. The more data we have, the better chance we have of eventually understanding what's happening. And if I want to avoid experiencing it again, take a different route. There are 3 other crossings of the Missouri River within reasonable distance. Add 40 minutes to your trip, but avoid the Garrison Bridge entirely. That's what most drivers do once they become aware of its reputation. Poe thanked Finch and left the Steel Horse Roadhouse with more questions than answers. The rational part of his mind still wanted to dismiss the entire conversation as the paranoid delusions of people who spent too much time alone on dark highways. But the part that had seen 4 trucks enter a bridge and only 3 emerge knew better. For the next 2 weeks, Poe made his scheduled runs across Montana, deliberately avoiding routes that would take him near the Garrison Bridge. He told himself it was just practical route planning, taking advantage of less congested highways. But he knew the truth. He was avoiding a location that had demonstrated its capacity to bend the rules of normal reality. Then came the night when avoiding it was no longer an option. A late-night emergency delivery, pharmaceutical supplies that needed to reach Great Falls by morning, and the only route that made the timing work was Highway 87 straight through Garrison. Poe almost refused the job. But the pay was substantial, his employer was counting on him, and some stubborn part of his personality refused to let an unexplained event dictate his professional choices. He accepted the delivery, loaded his truck, and departed at 11:37 p.m., knowing he'd reach the Garrison Bridge around 1:45 a.m., the dead of night, when the highway would be nearly deserted. As he drove through the darkness, Poe's mind kept returning to Finch's map, to all those marked locations where reality occasionally stumbled. What was it about certain places that made them prone to these incidents? And more unsettling, what determined whether you simply observed an anomaly or became caught up in one yourself? The miles rolled past, marked by occasional small towns glowing like islands of light in the vast Montana darkness. Traffic was sparse to non-existent, a handful of other long-haul truckers, one highway patrol car that paced him for a few miles before turning off, and otherwise just the road and his headlights carving tunnels through the night. At 1:39 a.m., Poe crested the rise that gave him his first view of the Garrison Bridge. From this distance, it was just a silhouette against the star-filled sky, its lights creating small points of illumination along its length. Everything looked normal, mundane, utterly ordinary. But as Poe began his approach, he noticed his CB radio was emitting that same unusual static he'd experienced during his previous crossing. The sound pulsed with an odd rhythm, almost like a heartbeat, and underneath it, he thought he could detect something that might have been voices, too distorted and distant to comprehend. His dashboard clock read 1:43 a.m., 2 minutes until he reached the bridge proper. Poe's hands tightened on the steering wheel, every sense alert for anything unusual. The bridge lights grew brighter as Poe approached, his truck's engine settling into the steady rumble that came from years of reliable maintenance. At 1:44 a.m., he reached the southern approach, the familiar expansion joints beginning their rhythmic thumping beneath his wheels. Everything seemed normal. No mysterious convoys, no phantom vehicles, just empty highway and the sound of moving water far below. Poe keyed his CB microphone, more for his own comfort than any practical purpose. "This is southbound freight crossing Garrison Bridge for anyone monitoring. Solo vehicle, pharmaceutical cargo, no issues to report." The static on the CB didn't change, but something else did. As Poe entered the main span of the bridge, his peripheral vision caught movement in his passenger side mirror. He glanced at it quickly, expecting to see perhaps a bird or some debris caught in the wind. Instead, he saw headlights. Behind him, maybe a quarter-mile back, approaching the bridge's southern entrance. Poe's immediate reaction was relief. Another driver, normal traffic, nothing mysterious about it. But then he processed what he was seeing more carefully. Those headlights had not been visible seconds ago when he'd checked his mirrors. The road behind him had been empty for miles. Where had this vehicle come from? He kept driving, maintaining steady speed across the bridge while watching his mirrors. The following vehicle entered the bridge span, its headlights creating stark shadows among the steel trusses. It was definitely a truck, likely commercial based on the height and spacing of the lights, and it was maintaining a constant distance behind him, not closing the gap, not falling back, just matching his speed precisely. Poe's dashboard clock showed 1:45 a.m. He was about halfway across the bridge now, with perhaps 45 more seconds until he reached the northern side. The truck behind him continued its matched pace, and Poe found himself counting the seconds until he'd be safely off the span and able to pull over to get a better look at his mysterious follower. At 1:46 a.m., Poe cleared the bridge's northern approach and immediately pulled into a turnout, just as he had during his previous crossing. He set his parking brake and grabbed his flashlight, ready to identify the vehicle that had followed him across. He waited. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15. No truck emerged from the bridge. The span behind him was empty, its lights illuminating nothing but concrete and steel. Poe stepped out of his cab, flashlight in hand, and walked to the edge of the turnout where he had an unobstructed view of the bridge. The structure was completely empty. No vehicles, no lights, nothing to indicate that anything had crossed behind him. The CB in his cab was still emitting that strange static pattern. Poe returned to his truck and grabbed the microphone. "If there's anyone on this channel who just crossed the Garrison Bridge northbound, please respond. I saw your headlights behind me. Please confirm your position." The static pulsed, and for just a moment Poe thought he heard something underneath it. A voice, perhaps, or what might have been words. But the sound was so distorted and brief that he couldn't be certain. He tried again. "This is the northbound pharmaceutical truck to any vehicle that crossed Garrison Bridge at 1:45 a.m. Please respond." Nothing but static. Poe stood beside his truck, flashlight off, staring back at the empty bridge. 2 crossings, 2 impossible events. This wasn't coincidence or fatigue. Something about this location was fundamentally wrong, and he'd now experienced it from both directions. Vehicles disappearing ahead of him, vehicles appearing behind him. Whatever mechanism was at work here didn't follow normal rules. His phone showed no signal, which wasn't surprising for this remote stretch. But he remembered Finch's instructions. Document everything immediately, while the details were fresh. Poe pulled out a small notebook he kept for delivery logs and began writing. Time, 1:46 a.m. Location, Garrison Bridge, north side. Event, vehicle with headlights followed me onto bridge, maintained distance approximately quarter-mile back. No vehicle emerged, radio showing unusual static patterns throughout crossing. Temperature 52 degrees F, clear night, no weather factors. He paused, then added, "This is my second anomalous experience at this location in 2 weeks. Something is affecting vehicles and perception in this specific area." As he wrote, Poe became aware of another sound beneath the engine noise in the distant river. It was a low hum, almost subsonic, that he felt more than heard. The frequency seemed to resonate in his chest cavity, creating an uncomfortable vibration that made his teeth ache slightly. Poe walked away from his truck, trying to isolate the sound. It seemed to be coming from the bridge itself, or perhaps from the water below it. The sound wasn't constant, it pulsed with the same odd rhythm as the CB static, creating a sensation of breathing or heartbeat. A light caught his attention at the far southern end of the bridge. Poe raised his flashlight, but the beam didn't reach that far. The light he was seeing wasn't a vehicle headlight. It was softer, more diffuse, and it seemed to move independently of any vehicle. It drifted slowly from one side of the bridge to the other, then descended below the deck level, disappearing from view. Poe wanted to investigate, wanted to walk back onto the bridge and determine what he was seeing, but every instinct screamed against it. Going back onto that bridge at night alone, with evidence that normal physics didn't apply here, that was how people disappeared permanently. Instead, he returned to his truck, fired up the engine, and continued north toward Great Falls. He'd document the experience. He'd report it to Finch Abernathy. But he wouldn't put himself at additional risk by confronting whatever was happening at the Garrison Bridge in the middle of the night. The rest of the drive passed without incident. Poe delivered his pharmaceutical cargo on schedule, filed his paperwork, and found a truck stop where he could grab a few hours of sleep before the return journey. But sleep eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those headlights in his mirror, that impossible vehicle that had followed him onto the bridge and then ceased to exist. At 7:15 a.m., he gave up on sleep and called Finch Abernathy. The phone rang 6 times before Finch answered, his voice alert despite the early hour. "It happened again," Poe said without preamble. "Different phenomenon, but same location. I need to talk to you." They met 3 hours later at a diner in Great Falls, far from the Steel Horse Roadhouse and its atmosphere of collected strangeness. In the harsh fluorescent light of a chain restaurant, Poe recounted his second Garrison Bridge experience, while Finch took notes and asked pointed questions. "The light you saw," Finch said when Poe finished. "You said it was diffuse, moving independently. Did it have any color, any specific characteristics?" "Pale, almost white. It reminded me of," Poe struggled for the comparison, "of moonlight on water. That kind of soft, reflective quality." Finch made a note, underlining something twice. 2 other reports mentioned similar lights. One described them as phosphorescent. Another called them marsh lights. Both sightings occurred during night crossings. Both involved additional anomalous events, time distortions in one case, navigation impossibilities in the other. So, the lights are connected to whatever mechanism causes the other phenomena? Possibly. Or they're separate but related effects, like different symptoms of the same underlying condition. Finch pulled out his larger map again, this time focusing on the Garrison Bridge location. "I've been researching the history of this site. The current bridge was built in 1976, but there have been river crossings at this location since the 1890s. Ferries initially, then a wooden bridge that was destroyed in the flood of 1908, then a steel bridge that lasted until 1975. Are there historical reports of unusual events? Nothing documented officially, but I found some interesting entries in local historical society archives. Letters from the ferry operator in 1897 mentioning travelers who claimed to have crossed when the ferry wasn't running. Newspaper accounts from the 1930s about vehicles found abandoned near the old steel bridge with no explanation. Nothing definitive, but enough to suggest this location has had strange associations for over a century. So, whatever's causing it predates the modern bridge. It's something about the location itself. That's my working theory. The bridge is just the current structure that spans the anomalous zone. Replace it with another bridge, and you'd probably still get the same effects." Finch folded his map. "The question is whether you want to keep engaging with this location or actively avoid it." "Avoid it," Poe said immediately. "Whatever intellectual curiosity I might have isn't worth the risk of becoming one of your disappearance statistics. Smart choice. Though I should mention, avoiding it completely might not be entirely possible. These anomalous locations seem to have a kind of attraction effect. Drivers who've experienced events at one location report being drawn back to it, sometimes unconsciously. Routes they thought would avoid it somehow lead them back. Delivery schedules change unexpectedly, putting them on the exact highway they'd planned to skip. You're saying the locations pull people back. I'm saying the pattern of repeat experiences is statistically unusual. Whether that's psychological, people subconsciously seeking to understand what they experienced, or something else I can't say, but be aware of it." They talked for another hour. with Finch sharing more details from his years of research. The picture that emerged was deeply unsettling. Dozens of locations across the northwestern states where ordinary physics seemed to occasionally malfunction, where vehicles and people could disappear, or duplicate or experience impossible events. And underlying it all, no explanation, no pattern comprehensive enough to allow prediction or prevention. "The worst part," Finch said, as they prepared to part ways, "is that I've been documenting this for 8 years, and I'm no closer to understanding the mechanism. I can map the locations, catalog the events, but I can't explain why they happen or what determines who experiences them." "Maybe it's not explainable," Poe suggested. "Maybe it's just one of those things we have to accept exists without understanding. Maybe. But that acceptance comes hard for people who rely on predictability and logic for their survival. Truckers navigate by maps and schedules and known routes, having to accept that sometimes the rules just don't apply." Finch shook his head. "It undermines the fundamental assumptions we use to make sense of the world." After leaving the diner, Poe sat in his truck for a long time, staring at his route planning software. He had 3 delivery options for the next week, and he carefully analyzed each one, ensuring none would take him within 20 miles of the Garrison Bridge. He'd follow Finch's advice and actively avoid the location, even if it meant longer routes and reduced efficiency. But as he plotted his courses, a thought nagged at him. If the bridge, or the underlying location, really did have some kind of attraction effect, how would he even know if he was being drawn back? Would the routes seem like coincidence? Would he rationalize the choices as practical even as they led him back to the anomalous zone? The uncertainty was maddening. Poe had spent his entire adult life in a profession that rewarded careful planning and predictable execution. The idea that some locations could override human intention, could manipulate circumstances to draw people back regardless of their desires, violated every principle he'd built his career on. Over the next 2 months, Poe managed to avoid Highway 87 entirely. He took alternate routes, accepted deliveries that went nowhere near the Garrison Bridge, and began to relax slightly. Perhaps the attraction effect was overstated, or perhaps it simply didn't apply to him. Either way, distance and time were helping him process the experiences as strange but concluded chapters of his life. Then, on a cold November morning, Poe received an emergency delivery assignment. Time-sensitive medical equipment needed to reach a hospital in Great Falls within 6 hours. The client was willing to pay premium rates, his dispatcher emphasized, and Poe was the only driver available who could make the timeline. "What's the optimal route?" Poe asked, though he already knew. "Highway 87 through Garrison. It's the only way to make the delivery window. Any other route adds at least 90 minutes, which puts you outside the acceptable time frame." Poe wanted to refuse, but the practical realities of his profession made that difficult. This was emergency medical equipment, potentially life-saving, and turning it down because of unexplained previous experiences at a bridge would raise questions he wasn't prepared to answer. "I'll take it," he heard himself say. "Loading in 30 minutes? Cargo's ready now. Clock's ticking." As Poe drove toward the depot, he told himself it would be fine. He'd cross the bridge, make his delivery, and nothing unusual would happen. Lightning didn't strike twice, or in this case, 3 times. The anomalies were rare, affecting only a small percentage of crossings. The odds were overwhelmingly in favor of a normal, uneventful trip. But as he loaded the medical equipment and began the drive south toward Highway 87, Poe couldn't shake the feeling that coincidence wasn't an adequate explanation for how this delivery had found him. The timing, the route requirements, the way it had bypassed all his careful planning to avoid the bridge. It felt orchestrated, though by what or whom he couldn't imagine. The November afternoon was overcast, with low clouds threatening rain or snow. Poe made good time despite the weather, his truck eating up the miles as he approached the now familiar territory. With each passing mile marker, the tension in his shoulders increased, until, by the time he was 15 miles from the bridge, he felt like coiled wire. At 3:47 p.m., the Garrison Bridge came into view. In the gray afternoon light, it looked different than during his night crossings, more industrial, less atmospheric, its steel framework stark against the clouded sky. Normal traffic was crossing in both directions. 2 cars heading north, a pickup truck going south. Everything appeared completely ordinary. Poe approached the southern entrance at a steady speed, his eyes scanning for anything unusual. The cars ahead of him crossed without incident. The pickup passed him heading the opposite direction, the driver raising a hand in the casual wave common among rural highway users. Normal, mundane, reassuring. He entered the bridge's main span, the familiar thump of expansion joints marking his progress. His CB radio was quiet. No unusual static, no strange pulses. His dashboard clock and gauges all showed normal readings. He was going to cross without incident, complete his delivery, and put the whole thing behind him. Poe was about 2/3 across the bridge when the light changed. Not the overhead bridge lights or his headlights, but the ambient daylight itself. It shifted, becoming softer and somehow thicker, as if the air had taken on a different density. The sensation lasted only a second or two, but it was unmistakable. A ripple in normality, like heat waves on summer pavement. And then he saw it, in his rearview mirror. Not a vehicle this time, but a figure. Standing at the exact center of the bridge, facing his direction. Motionless, despite the steady traffic flow around it. Poe's first instinct was to stop, to back up and check if someone needed help. But traffic behind him made that impossible, and some deeper instinct screamed against stopping on the bridge itself. He completed the crossing, his eyes fixed on his rearview mirror, watching the figure diminish with distance. On the north side, he pulled into the same turnout he'd used twice before. His hands were shaking slightly as he set the parking brake and grabbed his phone. No signal, as expected. He reached for his CB radio, then hesitated. Who would he call? What would he even say? The figure was still visible on the bridge, a dark silhouette against the gray sky. As Poe watched, it moved, not walking, but somehow shifting position without apparent motion. One moment it was at the center of the bridge, the next it was closer to the north end, though Poe hadn't seen it cross the intervening distance. A semi-truck passed Poe's position, heading south toward the bridge. He watched intently, waiting to see if the southbound driver would react to the figure. The truck drove straight through the location where the figure stood, giving no indication that the driver had seen anything unusual. The figure was still there, unchanged, unaffected by a 40-ton vehicle passing through its space. Poe grabbed his binoculars from the cab storage and focused on the figure. Even with magnification, details were difficult to discern. The shape was human, 2 legs, torso, head, but there was something off about the proportions or posture. And the way light interacted with it wasn't quite right, as if the figure existed slightly out of phase with its surroundings. His phone buzzed with an incoming message, the first signal he'd received since approaching the bridge. Poe glanced at the screen. The message was from an unknown number, just 3 words, "Don't look back." Poe's blood went cold. He checked the number again, but it showed only as unknown. The message had been sent approximately 2 minutes ago, which meant it had been waiting in the network until his phone caught a signal. He typed back, "Who is this? How do you know where I am?" The response came almost immediately. "You're where you're meant to be. The bridge chooses. Don't interfere." Poe's mind raced. Someone knew he was here, knew about the bridge, knew about the figure. Was this Finch Abernathy testing him somehow? or someone else with knowledge of these anomalous locations. He tried calling the unknown number, but the call went directly to a non-existent voicemail. He sent another text. "I need answers. What's happening at this bridge?" No response. Poe waited 3 minutes, watching his phone and periodically checking the bridge. The figure remained visible, though its position seemed to shift subtly each time he looked away and back. Finally, a new message arrived. "Some locations are thin. Barriers permeable. The bridge is threshold. Those who cross with attention get drawn back. You've crossed with attention. Now the bridge knows you." The message's grammar was odd, as if written by someone for whom English was not a first language, or perhaps by something trying to approximate human communication patterns. Poe read it 3 times, trying to extract meaning. "What do you mean, the bridge knows me?" he typed back. The response came after a longer delay. "You've seen what others miss. That seeing creates connection. Connection creates obligation. The bridge has use for aware travelers." "Use for what?" Poe demanded. No response. He waited 10 minutes, but no further messages arrived. When he tried to review the conversation, he discovered the entire message thread had vanished from his phone. The unknown number no longer appeared in his recent contacts, and there was no record that the conversation had ever occurred. Poe checked his phone's message logs, his call history, even his deleted items folder. Nothing. It was as if those messages had been intercepted before being properly recorded by his device's memory, existing only in the transient moment of transmission. He was still processing this when movement on the bridge caught his attention. The figure was no longer alone. 2 additional shapes had appeared, positioned at the south and north ends of the span. Like the first figure, they were motionless, human-shaped, but somehow wrong, existing in that same slightly out-of-phase state. Traffic continued crossing the bridge normally, vehicles passing through the figures without slowing or reacting. Whatever Poe was seeing, it was apparently visible only to him, or at least only to those who had already experienced the bridge's anomalies. The medical equipment in his trailer needed to reach the hospital within 2 hours. Poe had a professional obligation to complete the delivery, but every instinct urged him to turn around, take an alternate route even if it meant missing the deadline. The bridge had become something more than a simple river crossing. It was an active entity in some sense, one that had apparently taken notice of him. Poe made his decision. He put his truck in gear and continued north, away from the bridge, driving faster than his usual careful pace. He'd find an alternate route, even if it meant calling his dispatcher and explaining that he couldn't use Highway 87. The delivery might be late, but at least he'd arrive. He'd driven approximately 3 miles when his engine began to sputter. The dashboard lights flickered, and the truck's power dropped precipitously. Poe managed to coast to the shoulder before the engine died completely. He tried to restart it. The starter motor cranked, but the engine wouldn't catch. He checked the gauges. Fuel was good, temperature normal, no obvious mechanical failure indicated. Yet the truck refused to start. Poe was a competent mechanic, capable of handling most roadside repairs. He popped the hood and began systematic diagnostics. Fuel pump was working. Battery had charge. No visible leaks or damaged components. After 20 minutes of investigation, he'd found nothing wrong with the truck. It simply wouldn't start, for no reason he could identify. His phone showed 2 bars of signal. Poe called his company's roadside assistance line and explained the situation. They'd send a mechanic, but given his remote location, estimated arrival time was 90 minutes to 2 hours. "The medical equipment," Poe said. "It needs to reach Great Falls Hospital within 2 hours. Can you coordinate an alternate driver?" "We'll try, but that's a tight window. Stand by for callback." Poe stood beside his disabled truck, staring back toward the garrison bridge in the distance. The timing of this mechanical failure, immediately after he'd decided to avoid the bridge, just far enough away to prevent alternate routing, seemed too precise to be coincidental. His phone rang. Not his dispatcher, but the unknown number from before. The number that shouldn't exist, that had left no record of previous calls. Poe answered. "Who is this?" The voice that responded was strange, layered, as if multiple people were speaking in imperfect synchronization. "You chose wrong. The bridge requires passage." "What are you talking about? What does the bridge require?" "Aware travelers must complete crossing. You've left obligation unfulfilled. Return. Complete. Or remain stranded." "Is this some kind of threat? Did you sabotage my truck?" "Truck is consequence, not cause. Reality at bridge location has been disturbed by your partial engagement. Complete the crossing properly, or remain in disturbed state." The call ended abruptly. Poe immediately tried calling back, but the number showed as invalid. He stood on the empty highway shoulder trying to process what he'd just heard. If he believed the call, and he wasn't sure he did, his truck would start again only if he returned to the bridge and crossed it properly, whatever that meant. The alternative was waiting here for a mechanic who might or might not be able to fix a vehicle that had no apparent mechanical problems, while time-sensitive medical equipment sat useless in his trailer. Poe climbed back into his cab and tried the ignition one more time. The starter cranked, but the engine remained dead. He sat in silence for 30 seconds, weighing his options. Then, feeling like he was making a terrible mistake, he shifted into neutral and released the brake. His truck was on a slight downgrade. Gravity began pulling it backward, toward the bridge. Poe let it roll for about 50 feet, then reapplied the brake and tried the ignition again. The engine caught immediately, rumbling to life as if it had never failed. Poe sat very still, his hands on the steering wheel, contemplating the implications. His truck had started the instant he'd begun rolling back toward the bridge. That wasn't mechanical coincidence. That was something responding to his choice, to his direction of movement. He had two options: complete the crossing, deliver the medical equipment, and accept that he was somehow entangled with whatever the garrison bridge represented. Or refuse, call for a tow truck, and abandon the delivery regardless of consequences. Poe thought about the hospital waiting for the equipment, about patients whose treatment might depend on its timely arrival. He thought about his professional reputation, his decades of reliable service, and he thought about those figures on the bridge, waiting for something, possibly waiting for him. He put the truck in gear and drove back toward the bridge. As he approached, the three figures were still visible, one at each end, one in the middle. But as Poe entered the southern approach, they began to move. Not walking, but transitioning through space, converging toward the center of the span. Poe's grip on the steering wheel was tight enough to hurt. Every rational part of his mind was screaming at him to turn around, to refuse to engage further with this impossible situation. But he kept driving, maintained steady speed, committed to completing the crossing. The figures merged at the bridge's center, their separate shapes blending into a single form that grew more distinct as Poe approached. Details resolved that hadn't been visible before. Clothing that looked decades out of date. Faces that were somehow too smooth, too uniform, as if drawn from memory rather than formed by genetics and time. Poe drove straight through the merged figure. For an instant, his vision whited out, not blindness but overwhelming brightness, as if he'd driven into a flashbulb. Sensations that weren't quite sound or touch flooded through him, whispers in languages he didn't recognize, pressure against his skin like deep water, the taste of copper and ozone. Then he was through it, emerging on the north side of the bridge with his vision clearing and the normal sounds of road and engine returning. The figures were gone. The light had returned to its normal overcast gray. His CB radio crackled with normal static, no unusual pulses or hidden voices. Poe drove another mile before pulling over, needing to collect himself. His hands were shaking, and he felt simultaneously exhausted and hyper-alert, as if he'd just survived a near accident. He checked his mirrors compulsively, half expecting to see the figures reappear or his truck to fail again. But everything remained normal. The road behind him was empty. His truck ran smoothly. His dashboard clock showed 4:23 p.m., enough time to complete the delivery if he didn't encounter further delays. Poe drove to Great Falls, delivered the medical equipment on schedule, and accepted the hospital's grateful thanks. He filed his paperwork mechanically, his mind elsewhere, trying to process what had occurred. On the surface, he'd simply crossed a bridge, experienced a moment of sensory distortion, and completed a delivery. But he knew it had been something more significant, some kind of transaction or acknowledgement he didn't fully understand. That night, parked at a truck stop north of Great Falls, Poe called Finch Abernathy and recounted the entire experience. Finch listened without interrupting, then was quiet for a long moment. "You completed what they wanted," Finch finally said. "Whatever intelligence or mechanism operates at that bridge, it had identified you as aware, someone who could perceive its anomalies. Once you're aware, it apparently expects completion of the crossing, some kind of full engagement rather than partial observation. But why? What purpose does it serve? I don't know. Maybe it's not about purpose in any way we'd understand. Maybe it's just maintenance, like the bridge is simultaneously a physical structure and a metaphysical junction, and it requires certain actions from aware travelers to maintain its function." That's insane. Yes, but insane doesn't mean untrue. You experienced it. Your truck failed until you turned back, then started immediately. You drove through something that shouldn't exist, and it let you pass once you'd committed. Those are facts, even if they don't fit normal reality. Poe rubbed his eyes, exhaustion catching up with him. So, what now? Am I permanently connected to this bridge? Do I have to cross it regularly to maintain whatever I completed today? I don't think so. My research suggests that the obligation is one time. Once you've completed an aware crossing, you're released from the location's attention. You can cross again if needed, but it won't compel you or create interference if you avoid it. You don't sound certain. I'm not. This is all inference and pattern matching based on limited data. But I've interviewed 5 other drivers who had experiences similar to yours. Awareness, attempted avoidance, compelled return. All of them report that after completing one full aware crossing, subsequent trips through the location were uneventful. The bridge stops paying attention to you. Poe hoped that was true. But he also knew he'd avoid Highway 87 regardless, choosing alternate routes even if they added hours to his trips. He'd completed what the bridge required, but that didn't mean he wanted to test whether it would leave him alone. Over the following months, Poe kept his resolution. He took longer routes, accepted delays, turned down high-paying deliveries if they required crossing the Garrison Bridge. His employer questioned the routing choices, but Poe claimed he was dealing with a temporary anxiety issue related to a previous incident, which was true, if significantly understated. Finch Abernathy incorporated Poe's experience into his growing database of bridge-related anomalies. The pattern of aware travelers being compelled to complete crossings was now documented from multiple independent sources, adding to the picture of locations where reality operated under different rules. But for Poe, the academic documentation mattered less than the personal knowledge that he'd been fundamentally changed by the experience. He now knew with certainty that the world contained genuine mysteries. locations where the normal rules dissolved and something else, something aware and purposeful, operated. He'd crossed the threshold, completed the bridge's requirements, and been released. But the memory of those figures, that blinding transition moment, the sensation of driving through something that existed between normal states, those would stay with him for the rest of his life. Some drivers, when they heard whispers of his story through the informal network of the trucking community, asked him what it had been like. Poe found himself unable to answer adequately. How do you describe experiencing something that shouldn't exist? How do you convey the moment when your understanding of reality fundamentally shifts? It was like crossing a bridge, he'd eventually say, aware of the insufficient metaphor. Just a bridge over water, nothing special. Except for a few seconds in the middle, when it was everything except ordinary, when the bridge revealed what it really was underneath its mundane appearance. And when pressed for more details, he'd simply shake his head. Some things can't be explained. They can only be experienced. And if you're lucky, you experience them once and move on with your life. If you're unlucky, you get pulled back again and again until you understand whatever it is the location needs you to understand. And did you understand? They'd ask. Poe would consider the question carefully before answering. No, I don't think I was meant to understand. I was just meant to complete the crossing, to acknowledge what I'd seen, and to prove I could do it despite knowing the rules were different. After that, the bridge lost interest in me. I became just another driver again, invisible to whatever awareness operates at that location. So you're saying the bridge is alive somehow? I'm saying the bridge is a location where something else becomes possible. Whether that something is alive or aware in any way we'd recognize, I can't say. But it has needs, or requirements, or patterns it maintains. And if you catch its attention, you're part of that pattern until you've fulfilled whatever role it assigned you. The conversations always left people unsettled, which Poe supposed was appropriate. He was describing something that undermined the comfortable assumptions people use to navigate the world. Better to be unsettled and aware than comfortable and vulnerable to surprises. Years later, driving a different route through different states, Poe would occasionally think about the Garrison Bridge. He'd wonder if it was still catching drivers' attention, still compelling aware travelers to complete their crossings. He'd wonder about those figures he'd seen, whether they were always present or appeared only for specific people at specific times. But he never went back to verify. The bridge had released him, and he'd stay released. Some mysteries, once resolved to the minimum necessary degree, were best left undisturbed. The Garrison Bridge had taught him that lesson, and he'd carry it for the rest of his driving career. The bridge crosses the river still, serving its mundane purpose of connecting one shore to another. Thousands of vehicles cross it every year without incident, their drivers never knowing that beneath its ordinary structure exists something extraordinary. And perhaps that's how it should be, most people crossing a threshold, unaware they've passed between worlds. But for those who see, who become aware of the crossing's true nature, the bridge becomes something else entirely. A test, a requirement, a location where reality proves flexible enough to accommodate impossibilities. They complete their crossing, acknowledge what they've witnessed, and move on, changed but released, marked but free. Garland Poe was one of those aware travelers. The bridge had pulled him back, demanded his recognition, and finally let him go. He'd crossed the threshold and returned, carrying knowledge he couldn't fully articulate but would never forget. Some bridges span only water. Others span the boundary between what we think is real and what actually exists when normal rules momentarily relax their grip. The Garrison Bridge was both, and Poe had learned which truth mattered more. The prairie dawn comes in stages across North Dakota. First, the absolute black of night softens to charcoal. Then the eastern horizon begins to glow, a thin line of pale gold that gradually expands upward, pushing back the darkness in slow, predictable waves. By the time the sun actually crests the horizon, the transformation is already half complete. The landscape revealed in shades of amber and shadow that make the endless grain fields look like an ocean frozen mid-wave. Thaddeus Pike had witnessed this dawn progression thousands of times in his 26 years of hauling grain across the northern plains. At 48, he'd spent more mornings on Highway 52 between Jamestown and Minot than he cared to count. His truck loaded with wheat or barley or corn, destined for processing facilities that turned Dakota harvest into products shipped worldwide. The route was his bread and butter. Reliable work that paid decent money and followed roads he could navigate half asleep. On the morning of October 14th, 2021, Pike was part of a 4-truck convoy hauling wheat from a cooperative in Jamestown to a grain terminal outside Minot. The harvest had been good that year, and the co-op was pushing to move product before the weather turned. A convoy formation made sense for several reasons: mutual support in case of breakdowns, company on a long haul, and the psychological comfort of not being entirely alone on roads that could go 50 miles between towns. The convoy had formed up at 4:47 a.m. in the co-op's staging lot. Pike knew 2 of the other drivers by reputation, but had never worked with them directly. The lead truck was driven by Hollis Creed, a rookie with barely 8 months of commercial driving experience but a good safety record and the kind of cautious competence that suggested he'd last in the profession. The other 2 drivers were veterans like Pike, experienced hands who knew the routes and the rhythm of long-haul grain transport. They departed at 5:03 a.m., just as the first hint of pre-dawn light was beginning to soften the eastern sky. The convoy maintained loose formation, each truck about a quarter-mile apart, close enough to maintain visual contact but with sufficient spacing to allow for safe braking distances. Their CB radios were set to channel 19, the standard trucker frequency, and they'd established a check-in protocol. Every 30 minutes, each driver would report status, starting from the lead and working back to the tail position. Pike was running third in the formation, which suited him fine. The middle position meant he didn't have to worry about navigation. Just follow the taillights ahead and maintain proper spacing. The cargo was straightforward, the weather forecast was clear, and they'd reach Minot well before the terminal's midday receiving cutoff. A routine run, the kind Pike could practically do in his sleep. At 5:34 a.m., Hollis Creed's voice came through the CB with the first check-in. Lead truck, all systems green. Making good time, should hit the Pingree junction in about 20 minutes. The second truck responded immediately, confirming status. Pike thumbed his microphone. Third position, running smooth. Cargo secure, no issues. There was a brief pause before the fourth truck responded, the driver's voice carrying a note of concern. Tail position here. Anyone else seeing this fog developing? Pike checked his mirrors and the road ahead. The sky was continuing its slow transition from night to day, visibility improving with each passing minute. He could clearly see the taillights of the truck ahead of him, and beyond that, the faint glow of the lead truck's running lights. No fog was apparent from his position. Negative on fog from third position, Pike reported, seeing clear conditions ahead. Same here, Creed confirmed from the lead. Nothing but open road. The second truck also reported clear conditions. There was another pause before the tail position came back on. Must be a local pocket. It's pretty thick back here, but doesn't seem to be extending forward. I'll keep you posted if it gets worse. They continued for another 10 minutes without incident. The dawn light strengthened, revealing the characteristic North Dakota landscape. Vast grain fields stretching to the horizon, occasional farmhouses set back from the road, grain elevators rising like sentinels in the distance. Traffic was minimal, a few passenger vehicles heading in the opposite direction. No other commercial trucks visible in either direction. At 5:46 a.m., Pike noticed something odd. The taillights of the truck ahead of him seemed to flicker momentarily, as if passing behind a translucent curtain. He blinked, refocusing his eyes, and the lights stabilized. Probably just a reflection off his windshield, or maybe dust kicked up from the road surface. Nothing to worry about. But 30 seconds later, it happened again. The lights ahead dimmed, brightened, then dimmed once more before returning to normal. This time, Pike was paying close attention, and he realized it wasn't the lights that were changing. It was the air between his truck and the one ahead. Something was affecting visibility, some kind of atmospheric distortion that came and went in waves. "Second position," Pike called into his CB. "You experiencing any visibility issues up there?" "Negative, third position. Why, what are you seeing?" "Not sure. Intermittent distortion in my view of your taillights. Could be atmospheric, could be something on my windshield." Before the second truck could respond, Hollis Creed's voice cut in, higher pitched with concern. "All units, I'm hitting fog." It came up fast, visibility dropping to maybe 100 yards and decreasing. Pike looked ahead, but could still see the truck in front of him clearly. If Creed was encountering fog, it hadn't reached Pike's position yet. "Still clear at third position," he reported. "Same at second," the middle truck confirmed. "Tail position. Confirming fog has reached my location," the fourth truck reported. "Visibility down to about 50 yards and getting worse, reducing speed to 40. Pike's mind worked through the logistics. The convoy was spread over approximately a mile of highway. The lead truck and the tail truck were both reporting fog, but the two middle trucks were in clear air. That made no sense from a meteorological standpoint. Fog didn't selectively skip sections of highway. It formed in continuous banks based on temperature, humidity, and air pressure. What they were experiencing violated the normal patterns of weather formation. "Lead truck, this is third position," Pike transmitted. "Recommend we slow the convoy to 30 miles per hour and tighten up our spacing. If this fog is patchy, we need to stay close enough to render assistance if someone has trouble." "Agreed," Creed responded, his voice steadier now that someone else was taking a leadership role. "All units, reduce to 30 and close spacing to eighth-mile intervals. Report if visibility deteriorates further." Over the next 5 minutes, they executed the maneuver carefully. Pike watched the taillights ahead grow larger as the second truck slowed, and he adjusted his own speed to match. In his mirrors, he could see the headlights of the fourth truck growing brighter as it closed the distance from behind. The dawn light continued strengthening, which should have burned off any morning fog. Instead, Pike noticed his own visibility beginning to degrade. Not fog exactly, but a grayness that seemed to seep into the air itself, reducing contrast and making distances harder to judge. The taillights ahead remained visible, but appeared increasingly diffuse, as if viewed through a dirty window. At 5:54 a.m., the radio crackled with the fourth truck's voice. "Tail position experiencing significant deterioration. Visibility now less than 30 yards. I'm seeing strange lighting effects. The fog has this luminous quality, like it's lit from within. All units maintain current speed and spacing," Pike instructed, aware that he'd unconsciously assumed a coordinating role. "Don't attempt to pass through any fog banks quickly. If visibility drops below safe levels, we pull over and wait it out. Third position, are you in clear air or fog?" Creed asked. Pike looked around carefully before responding. "I'm in something, not quite fog, more like haze. Visibility, maybe 150 yards. The air has this gray quality to it, hard to describe. Second position, the middle truck reported. I'm entering it now. Gray haze, just like third position described. Everything looks washed out, colors muted. They were all in it now, Pike realized. Whatever atmospheric phenomenon was affecting the area had engulfed the entire convoy. And still, the sky overhead was clear, the rising sun visible as a bright disk on the eastern horizon. The grayness was localized to a layer perhaps 100 feet thick, sitting over the highway like a blanket. At 6:02 a.m., Rowena March's voice came through on a different channel, the company's dispatch frequency that all 4 trucks monitored. March was their dispatcher, a 30-year veteran of grain transport logistics who coordinated routes and schedules from an office in Fargo. Convoy Alpha 4, this is dispatch. We're showing unusual GPS signals from your formation, getting some dropouts and position discrepancies. Can you confirm your current location? Pike checked his Jeep unit. The screen showed their position on Highway 52, approximately 60 miles north of Jamestown, which matched his dead reckoning. But the GPS icon was flickering slightly, the position jumping around within a small area rather than showing smooth forward progress. Dispatch, this is third position. Our GPS is showing some instability, but we're definitely on Highway 52 northbound, about 60 miles out from origin. We're experiencing unusual atmospheric conditions, heavy gray haze affecting visibility. Copy that, third position. Weather Service isn't showing any fog advisories for your area. Current conditions should be clear with excellent visibility. Well, Weather Service is wrong, Pike said flatly. We're in thick gray haze, all 4 trucks. Visibility ranges from 30 to 150 yards depending on position. There was a pause before March responded. Understood. Keep me posted on conditions. I'm flagging this route for other drivers. We've got 2 more convoys scheduled to follow your path starting at 0700 hours. The next 10 minutes passed in tense silence, each driver focused on maintaining position and safe spacing in the degraded visibility. Pike found himself constantly adjusting speed, the gray haze making it difficult to judge the distance to the truck ahead. Several times the taillights seemed to recede or approach unexpectedly, forcing him to correct his speed more dramatically than he liked. At 6:13 a.m., something changed. Pike couldn't immediately identify what was different, just that the quality of the gray haze had shifted. It became denser, more uniform, pressing against his windshield like a physical presence. And then he saw the lights. They weren't headlights or taillights. They were diffuse glows in the gray, moving independently of any vehicles. Pike counted 4 of them, positioned roughly where the convoy trucks should be, but behaving strangely. 2 of the glows were ahead of him, which made sense. Those would be the lead and second trucks. 1 glow was behind him, the 4th truck, but there was a 5th glow, off to the right side of the highway, pacing the convoy at roughly the same speed. Pike keyed his CB. All units, is anyone off the main highway? I'm seeing lights that don't correspond to our formation. Negative, Creed responded. Lead truck is dead center on the highway. Second position, center lane, no deviation, the middle truck confirmed. Tail position, I'm on the highway, the 4th truck reported. But I'm also seeing extra lights. They're all around me, Pike. Not following the road, just moving through the gray. A chill ran down Pike's spine despite the warm cab. All units, call out your positions. Lead first, then sequential. State your truck number and confirm your place in the formation. Lead truck, Unit 723, first position, Creed called out clearly. Second position, Unit 889, the middle truck confirmed. Third position, Unit 551, Pike added. There was a pause. Then tail position, unit 647. That was 4 trucks, 4 drivers. But in the gray haze ahead of Pike, he was seeing 5 distinct glows. And based on the tail position's report, there were multiple lights visible from the rear as well. The math didn't add up. "Dispatch, this is 3rd position," Pike transmitted on the company channel. "We're experiencing anomalous conditions. Request immediate verification of convoy size. How many units do you show in Alpha 4? March's response came quickly. "Alpha 4 is 4 units, 723, 889, 551, and 647. Why, what are you seeing?" "I'm counting 5 light sources in our convoy formation," Pike said carefully. "Other drivers are reporting similar discrepancies. Are you saying there's an unidentified vehicle in your convoy?" "I'm saying I'm seeing lights that don't match our truck count, and I don't have a rational explanation for it." Before March could respond, Hollis Creed's voice came through on the CB channel, tight with controlled panic. "All units, the lights ahead of me just split. I'm seeing what looks like a truck, headlights, running lights, the whole profile, but it's pulling ahead at a speed we're not matching. I'm doing 30, but this thing is accelerating to maybe 50 or 60. Can you identify it? Make, model, any markings?" Pike asked. "That's the thing. It looks exactly like one of our trucks. Same profile, same light configuration, but it's not real. I can see through it slightly, like it's semi-transparent." Pike felt his grip on the steering wheel tighten. They were experiencing something well beyond unusual weather. The gray haze, the mysterious lights, the phantom truck that Creed was describing. All of it pointed to conditions that couldn't be explained by fog or atmospheric distortion. "All units, maintain current speed and formation," Pike instructed, falling back on procedure because it was all he could think to do. "Do not attempt to pursue or interact with any lights or vehicles that aren't part of our confirmed convoy." "Hollis, can you still see the phantom truck?" "Negative. It pulled ahead and disappeared into the gray. But..." Creed's voice trailed off. "But what?" "I think it turned off the highway. I saw the lights veer right, like it was taking an exit ramp. But there's no exit here. We're in the middle of nowhere, at least 10 miles from the nearest intersection." Pike checked his mental map of Highway 52. Creed was right. The section was arrow straight, no exits or side roads for miles. If a vehicle had turned off the highway, it had driven directly into farmland, which made no sense. At 6:19 a.m., the gray haze began to brighten. Not clearing exactly, but changing quality. The uniform grayness gave way to streaks and swirls, like smoke caught in a slow current. Through the swirls, Pike caught glimpses of clearer air. Patches where visibility extended to normal distances before the gray closed in again. "Visibility improving," the second truck reported. "Seeing breaks in the haze." Pike watched the patterns in the gray, and something about them triggered an instinctive unease. The swirls weren't random. They moved with purpose, circling the convoy formation as if examining it from multiple angles. And in the momentary clear patches, Pike saw something that made no sense. The landscape beyond the highway wasn't the familiar Dakota prairie. The grain fields were gone, replaced by terrain he didn't recognize. Rocky outcrops and sparse vegetation that looked more like badlands than agricultural country. "Anyone else seeing landscape changes?" Pike asked, his voice carefully neutral. There was a long pause before the tail truck responded. "Yeah, the fields are gone. I'm seeing... I don't know what I'm seeing. It's not right. Second position confirms. Terrain doesn't match Highway 52. Hollis Creed's voice came through, higher and more strained. "Guys, I think we need to stop. Pull over and wait for this to clear. Something's wrong, and we're driving blind into it." It was the sensible call, the safe call. but something about the gray haze and the swirling patterns made Pike hesitate. Stopping meant becoming stationary targets for whatever was happening. Staying in motion, maintaining forward progress, felt like the better option, even though he couldn't articulate why. "Lead truck, continue current course and speed," Pike said. "We're going to drive through this. The haze has to end eventually. We can't be in an infinite fog bank. Everyone stay tight on formation and keep calling out your status." They drove on, each driver alone with their thoughts and fears, connected only by the tenuous link of CB radio transmission. The gray continued its swirling motion. The landscape beyond flickered between familiar and alien, and somewhere ahead in the murk, phantom lights moved according to rules that defied understanding. At 6:27 a.m., the gray began to thin dramatically. Visibility extended to 100 yards, then 200, then suddenly broke completely. Pike found himself driving in clear morning air, the sun bright on the horizon, the familiar Dakota landscape stretching endlessly in all directions. He immediately checked his mirrors for the truck behind him. The fourth truck's headlights were clearly visible, maintaining proper spacing. Pike looked ahead to confirm the second truck's position. The road ahead was empty. "Lead truck, second truck, report positions," Pike transmitted, keeping his voice level despite the ice forming in his stomach. Static was the only response. "Hollis, Unit 889, do you copy?" More static, then fragments of what might have been voices, too distorted to understand. Pike grabbed his CB and switched through multiple channels, trying to raise either of the two trucks that had been ahead of him. Nothing but static and occasional bursts of interference. The fourth truck pulled up alongside Pike at a wide section of shoulder, both vehicles coming to a stop. Pike climbed down from his cab and met the other driver, whose weathered face was pale despite decades of sun exposure. "They were right there," the tail driver said without preamble. "I never lost visual contact, but when the gray cleared, they were gone." "Same from my position," Pike confirmed. "And I can't raise them on any channel." They stood on the empty highway in the bright morning sun, trying to process the impossible. Two trucks, two drivers, had simply vanished from the middle of a four-truck convoy. No side roads they could have taken, no accidents visible, no explanation that fit the observed facts. Pike pulled out his phone and checked for signal. 2 bars, enough for a call. He dialed dispatch. "Rowena, this is Thaddeus Pike. We have a situation." The North Dakota Highway Patrol arrived 47 minutes after Pike's call to dispatch. 2 patrol cars, their light bars creating red and blue strobes against the pale morning sky, pulled up to where Pike and the remaining tail driver had parked their trucks on the shoulder. The officers who emerged had the kind of measured competence that came from years of handling rural highway incidents. But Pike could see the confusion in their eyes as he explained the situation. "So, you're telling me 2 trucks just disappeared," the senior officer, whose name tag read Vanders, said slowly, as if trying to make sense of the words even as he spoke them. "In the middle of a convoy, while you maintained visual contact." "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Pike confirmed. "Lead truck was Unit 723, driver Hollis Creed. Second position was Unit 889. I never lost sight of their lights until the gray haze cleared. When visibility returned, they were gone." "And this gray haze, you're saying it was fog?" "I'm saying it was something. Gray, thick, affected visibility. Whether it was technically fog or some other atmospheric phenomenon, I can't tell you. What I can tell you is that all 4 trucks entered it, and only 2 came out." Vanders exchanged glances with his partner, a younger officer named Kemp. "We're going to need to search the highway," Vanders said. "If they left the road, there'll be tracks, disturbed vegetation, something. Trucks that size don't vanish into thin air." Over the next 2 hours, the search expanded. Highway patrol units drove the section of Highway 52 where the convoy had experienced the gray haze, examining both shoulders for any evidence of vehicles leaving the pavement. A state police helicopter joined the search, making sweeps of the farmland on either side of the highway. Local volunteer fire departments mobilized search parties to check farm roads and access paths. They found nothing. No tire tracks leading off the highway, no disturbed crops, no physical evidence that two fully loaded grain trucks had departed from the roadway. Pike watched the search efforts from his truck, feeling increasingly disconnected from reality. Vehicles weighing 70,000 pounds each didn't just cease to exist, but the absence of evidence was suggesting exactly that impossible conclusion. At 9:17 a.m., Rowena March arrived on scene, having driven from Fargo personally rather than coordinating by phone. She climbed into Pike's cab, her lined face showing the strain of the situation. "I've been in this business for 30 years, she said without preamble. Seen drivers go missing, seen trucks stolen, seen accidents that defied belief. But I've never seen anything like this. 2 trucks, 2 drivers, just gone without a trace." "What about their GPS?" Pike asked. "The company tracking system, it must show their last known positions." March pulled out a tablet and brought up the tracking interface. "That's the thing. Look at this." She showed him the screen, which displayed the convoy's route on a map. 4 tracking icons were visible, showing the truck's progression along Highway 52. But there was something odd about the display. "This is the recording from this morning, starting at 0500 hours. Pike watched as the 4 icons moved north along the highway in formation. Everything looked normal until approximately 0555 hours, when the icons began to behave strangely. They flickered, jumped position slightly, and then, at exactly 0627 hours, 2 of them simply disappeared from the display. "No data corruption?" Pike asked. "None. The system is solid, redundant backups, multiple verification protocols. Those 2 trucks stopped transmitting GPS signals at 6:27 a.m. precisely. Not fade out, not error messages, just instant cessation of signal. Like someone shut them off. Or like they stopped existing in any location the GPS satellites could track." March closed the tablet. "I've already filed reports with the state police and the FBI. A case this unusual triggers federal investigation protocols. Interstate commerce, potential hijacking, missing persons. They're taking it seriously." Pike nodded, unsurprised. "What about the families? Creed and the second driver? They've got people who need to know." "Notifications are being handled, but without bodies, without evidence of what happened." March's voice trailed off. "What do you tell someone? Your loved one drove into fog and vanished? It sounds insane." "It is insane," Pike said quietly. "But it happened. I watched it happen." The FBI agents arrived late that afternoon. A man and woman in dark suits who introduced themselves as Kowalski and Reed. They set up a mobile command post in a highway maintenance building 3 miles from the vanishing point and began conducting detailed interviews with Pike and the tail driver. "Walk me through the visibility conditions one more time," Agent Kowalski said, taking notes on a laptop. "You described it as gray haze, not traditional fog. What specifically made it different?" Pike tried to find the right words. "Regular fog has moisture, a wet quality. This was dry, almost dusty, and it had that strange luminous property lit from within, like the 4th driver described, plus the way it moved, the swirling patterns. Normal fog doesn't behave that way." "Could it have been dust? Particulate matter from the fields?" "No. Wrong color, wrong texture, and dust doesn't appear instantaneously. This gray came up fast, within minutes, and it affected our electronics, GPS flickering, radio interference." Agent Reed leaned forward. Let's talk about the additional lights you reported seeing. The ones that didn't correspond to known vehicles. 5 lights total, sometimes more, Pike confirmed. Our convoy was 4 trucks. I'm not claiming it was anything supernatural or alien, just stating what I observed. There were lights in the gray that weren't our trucks. Could they have been reflections? Atmospheric refraction creating duplicate images. Maybe. I'm not a meteorologist, but if that's what happened, it's the most elaborate optical illusion I've ever experienced. And it still doesn't explain where 2 trucks went. The interviews continued through the evening, each agent asking variations of the same questions, probing for inconsistencies or details Pike might have missed. He understood the process. They were building a comprehensive record, documenting every aspect of the event. But he could sense their frustration. Without physical evidence, without the missing trucks or drivers, the investigation had nowhere to go. At 7:43 p.m., as the autumn darkness settled over the prairie, Pike's phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, showing a local North Dakota area code but otherwise unidentified. "This is Pike," he answered. "Mr. Pike, my name is Dr. Elena Morrison. I'm a geophysicist at the University of North Dakota. I've been following the news reports about the missing trucks, and I think I may have relevant information." Pike sat up straighter. "What kind of information?" "I study atmospheric and electromagnetic anomalies in the Northern Plains region. What you experienced this morning matches patterns I've been documenting for the past 6 years. Would you be willing to meet with me? I have data that might help explain what happened." 20 minutes later, Pike was sitting in an all-night diner with Dr. Morrison, a woman in her early 40s with the intense focus of someone driven by questions others dismissed. She had a laptop and several accordion files filled with papers and printouts. The Northern Plains have some unique geological characteristics, Morrison began, spreading a map on the table. Deep subsurface formations of iron-rich rock, aquifers with unusual mineral content, and magnetic field variations that create pockets of electromagnetic anomaly. Most of the time, these factors are benign, but occasionally, under specific atmospheric conditions, they create phenomena that we don't fully understand. "Like gray haze that makes trucks disappear," Pike said, not bothering to hide his skepticism. "Like localized reality distortions," Morrison corrected. "I know how that sounds. Believe me, I spent years dismissing reports like yours as misidentification or driver fatigue, but the data doesn't support that conclusion. I have 37 documented cases over 6 years of vehicles experiencing unusual events on certain sections of highway in North Dakota and Montana. Time discrepancies, navigation impossibilities, visibility anomalies that don't match weather service reports." She pulled out a document covered with highlighted sections. "Look at this. October 2019, a convoy of 3 trucks on Highway 52, the exact same route you traveled today, reported driving through intense fog that weather radar showed didn't exist. When they emerged, their GPS logs showed they'd traveled 18 miles, but their odometers showed 23. 5 miles unaccounted for." "Odometer errors happen," Pike pointed out. "Not on 3 trucks simultaneously, with all systems showing the same discrepancy. That's not mechanical failure. That's something affecting the physical relationship between vehicles and their environment." Morrison pulled out another document. "May 2020, Highway 281 near Carrington. A solo trucker reported encountering a section of highway that repeated, drove the same 5-mile stretch 3 times despite maintaining constant forward motion. GPS confirmed his position was looping." "So you're saying, what, that there are places where normal physics breaks down?" I'm saying there are locations where the boundary between what we consider normal reality and something else becomes temporarily permeable. The electromagnetic anomalies I mentioned create zones where space, time, and causality don't follow expected rules. Under most conditions, these zones are dormant. But when specific factors align, atmospheric pressure, solar magnetic activity, perhaps even random quantum fluctuation, they activate. Pike absorbed this, his engineer's mind struggling with concepts that sounded more like science fiction than science. And you think that's what happened this morning? We drove into one of these zones? Based on your description, yes. The gray haze is characteristic. Multiple witnesses describe it similarly. The rapid onset, the luminous quality, the electromagnetic effects on GPS and radio, and most significantly, the vehicle disappearances. When these zones fully activate, they can create spatial discontinuities. Objects or people in the zone at peak activity can be displaced. Displaced where? Morrison met his eyes. That's the question I can't answer. The physics suggests they're still somewhere on Earth, just not in the spatial coordinates we'd expect. Shifted sideways, metaphorically speaking, into some parallel track. The problem is, once you're displaced, I don't know of any mechanism that brings you back. So you're telling me Hollis, Creed, and the other driver are still out there, just in some alternate location we can't reach. Or they've already returned, and we don't know it. One case I documented, a missing driver reappeared 6 weeks later on a highway 80 miles from where he'd vanished. He had no memory of the intervening time. His truck's odometer showed an additional 400 miles, but he couldn't account for where he'd been. Pike rubbed his eyes, exhaustion and stress catching up with him. Why isn't this common knowledge? If you've documented 36 cases, why aren't scientists studying this? They are. Or rather, a small community of researchers is. But we face two problems. The phenomena are rare and unpredictable, making controlled study impossible. And publishing findings about reality distortions is professional suicide. Mainstream science dismisses it as pseudoscience or delusion. So we work quietly, collect data, and hope someone eventually takes it seriously. Can you identify these zones? Map them so drivers can avoid them. Morrison shook her head. The zones aren't fixed locations. They're probabilistic. Certain areas have higher incidence rates, but activation seems random. I can tell you Highway 52 between Jamestown and Minot has elevated activity, but I can't predict when or where a zone will activate. They talked for another hour, Morrison sharing more cases and data, while Pike tried to reconcile this new understanding with his decades of driving experience. If Morrison was right, and her data was compelling enough that he couldn't dismiss it, then the roads he'd traveled his entire career were far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. As Pike drove back to where his truck was parked, his phone rang again. This time it was Agent Kowalski. "Mr. Pike, we've got a development. Security camera at a grain elevator approximately 40 miles from the vanishing point captured something. We need you to come look at it." The grain elevator security office was cramped, filled with monitors showing live feeds from various angles around the facility. Kowalski had pulled up footage from earlier that morning, time-stamped 6:31 a.m. "Watch this," the agent said, pointing to a monitor showing the approach road to the elevator. Pike watched the grainy footage. The road was empty for several seconds. Then a truck appeared, driving at normal speed. It looked exactly like the ones from his convoy. Same type of rig, same grain trailer configuration. The truck drove into the elevator's lot, circled once, as if the driver was disoriented, then drove back out toward the highway. "That's Unit 723, Pike said immediately, recognizing specific details of the truck's configuration. Hollis Creed's truck. We thought so too, but here's the strange part. Kowalski pulled up a different camera angle, this one showing a close-up of the truck as it circled. "Look at the cab." Pike leaned closer. The cab appeared empty. No driver visible in the seat, no one in the sleeper berth. The truck was driving itself, moving with purpose but without anyone at the controls. "That's impossible," Pike said automatically. "And yet, there it is. We've verified the footage. No digital manipulation, no camera tricks. A truck matching Unit 723's description appeared at this grain elevator 31 minutes after it vanished from your convoy, drove around in an empty lot, and left, with no driver. What about the second truck, Unit 889? No sightings yet. We've put out alerts to every facility, gas station, and camera system within a 100-mile radius. If it appears, we'll know." Pike stared at the frozen image on the screen. A truck that shouldn't exist, driven by no one, performing actions that violated every principle of mechanical operation. If this was real, if vehicles could be displaced into conditions where they operated independently of human control, then nothing he thought he understood about the world was reliable. "What do we do now?" Pike asked quietly. "We keep searching," Kowalski replied. "And we hope your missing colleagues reappear like that driver Morrison told you about. It's all we can do." The investigation into the convoy disappearances consumed the next 72 hours. FBI technicians established a comprehensive grid search pattern, examining every square mile of terrain within 50 miles of the vanishing point. Satellite imagery was reviewed, looking for heat signatures or visual anomalies. Every grain elevator, truck stop, and agricultural facility in the region was contacted and asked to check their lots for abandoned or unknown vehicles. Pike remained in the area, staying at a modest motel in Jamestown and checking in with investigators twice daily. His employer had placed him on paid administrative leave pending resolution of the incident, which Pike understood was corporate code for, "We don't know what to do with you." He spent his days driving the section of Highway 52 where the convoy had encountered the gray haze, searching for anything investigators might have missed. On the third day, he received another call from Dr. Morrison. "Mr. Pike, I've been analyzing the conditions from the morning of the incident. I think I've identified what triggered the zone activation." They met at the same diner as before. Morrison had new charts and data printouts, her expression showing the intense focus of someone who'd found a pattern in apparent chaos. October 14th was unusual from a geomagnetic standpoint, Morrison explained, spreading out a chart showing magnetic field data. There was a minor solar flare 3 days earlier, which caused elevated electromagnetic activity in Earth's magnetic field. Not enough to cause auroras or power grid disruptions, but enough to affect sensitive instruments. And that triggered the reality distortion. It created favorable conditions, but there was another factor, atmospheric pressure. "Look at this weather data." She showed him a second chart. At approximately 0545 hours on October 14th, a rapidly moving, low-pressure system passed through your exact location. The combination of electromagnetic instability and sudden pressure change created what I call a resonance event. Resonance between what? Between the subsurface geological formations and the atmosphere above them. The iron-rich rock acts like a massive magnetic capacitor. When conditions are right, it discharges energy in ways we don't fully understand. That discharge manifests as spatial temporal distortions, the zones where trucks vanish and physics misbehaves. Pike studied the charts, his mind working through the implications. "So you're saying this was a predictable event? That we could have known the zone would activate?" "In hindsight, yes. The warning signs were there in the data. But nobody was looking for them because nobody except a handful of researchers believes these phenomena are real." Morrison closed her laptop. The frustrating part is that I could have prevented this. If I'd been monitoring conditions that morning and had a way to contact your dispatcher, I could have warned you to take an alternate route. It's not your fault, Pike said. You're one person trying to document something that most people dismiss as impossible. The responsibility lies with... He stopped, unsure where to place blame. With himself, for leading the convoy into danger? With his employer, for not taking Morrison's research seriously? With reality itself, for operating under rules that made trucks disappear? His phone buzzed with an incoming text. The number was unknown, the message brief. Check mile marker 183. Look for signs. Pike showed the message to Morrison. Mean anything to you? Her expression sharpened. Mile marker 183 is right in the center of the high-activity zone. If you're going to find evidence of what happened, that's where it would be. They drove to the location together, Morrison following in her own vehicle. Mile marker 183 sat in the middle of a long, straight section of Highway 52. Surrounded on both sides by harvested grain fields, nothing distinguished it from dozens of other markers along the road. Pike parked on the shoulder and began walking the area, Morrison documenting everything with a handheld electromagnetic field meter. For 20 minutes they found nothing unusual, just highway, fields, and the endless prairie wind. Then Pike noticed something. At the very edge of the pavement, barely visible, was a scuff mark. It was fresh, the rubber streak standing out against the weathered asphalt. Pike knelt to examine it more closely. This wasn't here the other day when Highway Patrol searched, he said. And look at the angle. It's pointing off the highway, like a truck started to turn but didn't complete the maneuver. Morrison checked her field meter. I'm getting elevated readings here. About 3 times normal background electromagnetic radiation. Not dangerous, but definitely anomalous. Pike walked further, following the trajectory suggested by the scuff mark. 10 feet into the grain field, he found tire tracks, deep impressions in the soft soil left by a heavy vehicle. The tracks continued for perhaps 50 feet before simply stopping, as if the truck creating them had been lifted straight up into the air. Dr. Morrison, you need to see this. She joined him, her meter now registering even higher readings. The electromagnetic signature is strongest right where the tracks end. Whatever happened here, this is the epicenter. Pike pulled out his phone and called Agent Kowalski, describing what they'd found. The FBI agent promised to dispatch a forensics team immediately. While they waited, Pike and Morrison continued their examination of the site. The tire tracks were unmistakably from a commercial truck. The tread pattern and depth matched the type of vehicle in their convoy, but the track's abrupt termination defied explanation. Morrison took soil samples from the endpoint, noting that the earth showed signs of being compressed far more than the truck's weight alone could account for. It's like something pushed down from above while the truck was here, she observed, creating pressure beyond what the vehicle's mass would generate. Pushed down by what? That's what I can't answer. The zone activation creates spatial distortions, but the mechanism isn't gravitational. It's something else, some force we don't have a name for. The FBI forensics team arrived 40 minutes later, accompanied by Agent Kowalski and a civilian consultant who introduced himself as Dr. Marcus Webb, a physicist from Los Alamos National Laboratory. Webb listened to Morrison's explanation of geomagnetic resonance and spatial distortions with the kind of intense attention that suggested he wasn't entirely dismissive. We've encountered similar phenomena in other contexts, Webb said carefully. Locations where magnetic anomalies create measurable effects on local space-time geometry. Usually, the effects are subtle, nanosecond variations in atomic clock readings, minor GPS errors, but under extreme conditions, he gestured at the tire tracks. This is consistent with a localized spatial compression event. In English, please, Kowalski requested. The space at this location was temporarily compressed, folded in on itself. Any object occupying that space when compression occurred would be displaced to elsewhere. Where that elsewhere is, I can't say with certainty. Could they still be alive? Pike asked. The drivers, wherever they are? Webb considered the question. If the displacement preserved their biological integrity, possibly. But we're in completely theoretical territory here. I don't know of any documented cases where someone survived and returned from this type of event. I have one documented case, Morrison interjected. The driver I mentioned to Mr. Pike. He reappeared 6 weeks after his displacement, apparently unharmed, though with no memory of where he'd been. One case in how many incidents? Webb asked. 37, documented over 6 years. Webb's expression darkened. So, a roughly 3% survival rate, if we're being optimistic. The forensics team spent the rest of the day examining the site, taking measurements, collecting samples, and documenting every detail. Pike watched from his truck, feeling increasingly helpless. Somewhere, possibly, Hollis Creed and the other driver were still alive, trapped in some displaced location. But without understanding the mechanism that had taken them, rescue was impossible. As dusk settled over the prairie, Pike's phone rang. The caller ID showed unknown again. This is Pike. Mr. Pike, this is Hollis Creed. Pike sat bolt upright, his heart racing. Hollis, where are you? Are you okay? The voice was distant, breaking up with static, but definitely Creed's. I don't know where I am. I'm still in my truck, but the landscape outside doesn't match any place I know, and my GPS is showing coordinates that don't make sense. Stay on the line. I'm getting help. Pike waved urgently at Kowalski, who was walking toward his car. The agent jogged over, and Pike put the phone on speaker. Hollis, this is FBI Agent Kowalski. Can you describe your surroundings? I'm on what looks like Highway 52, but it's different. The road is older, cracked pavement, no lane markings. The fields around me aren't grain, they're wild grass, like the land was never cultivated. And I haven't seen another vehicle or any sign of people for... There was a pause. I don't know how long. My watch stopped at 6:27 a.m. and I haven't been able to get it working again. What about your truck? Is it operational? Engine runs, but instruments are behaving strangely. The GPS is locked on coordinates that place me somewhere in Saskatchewan, but I know I haven't crossed the border. Radio doesn't work. I can't raise anyone on CB or commercial frequencies. This phone connection is the first communication I've had. Hollis, this is Thaddeus Pike. How did you get my number? I didn't call you. I just pressed the call button on my phone, and it connected to your voice. Like the phone knew who I needed to reach. Morrison had appeared at Pike's side, listening intently. Ask him about the environment. Does he see sun? Stars? What's the sky like? Pike relayed the question. Creed's response came after a moment. Sky is wrong. It's darker than it should be for this time of day, and the stars, when night comes, the constellations aren't right. I'm seeing star patterns that don't match any astronomy I know. He's in a parallel spatial track, Morrison said quietly. Same planet, possibly same timeline, but with different developmental history. The human infrastructure isn't there, or it developed differently. Can we get him back? Kowalski demanded. I don't know. If the zone that displaced him activates again at his current location, maybe. But I can't predict when or where that might happen. Creed's voice came through the speaker again, more agitated. There's something else. I've been seeing lights at night, not vehicle lights, something else, moving through the fields. They don't follow roads or paths, just drift across the landscape. I've tried approaching them, but they stay ahead of me, always just beyond reach. Don't approach them, Morrison said urgently. Those lights could be markers indicating where the spatial boundary is thin. Getting too close might cause another displacement. Hollis, listen to me, Pike said. We're going to figure out how to bring you back, but you need to stay put, maintain your position. Don't drive toward those lights, don't try to find a way home on your own. We'll come to you. How? If you can't reach me and I can't reach you, how? The call cut off abruptly, leaving only dead silence. Pike immediately tried calling back, but the number showed as disconnected. He tried a dozen more times over the next hour, with no success. Whatever temporary connection had allowed Creed to reach him had closed. That night, Pike couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Creed, alone in his truck on some parallel version of Highway 52, watching unexplained lights drift across fields that shouldn't exist. And somewhere else, perhaps in a similar displaced location, the second driver from the convoy was experiencing the same isolation and fear. At 3:17 a.m., Pike gave up on sleep and drove back to mile marker 183. Morrison's electromagnetic meter sat on his passenger seat, borrowed with her reluctant permission. He parked at the spot where the tire tracks ended and began taking readings. The meter showed elevated levels, just as it had during daylight. But there was something else, a rhythmic pulsing in the electromagnetic field, a pattern that reminded Pike of breathing or a heartbeat. He watched the meter's needle swing back and forth, the pulses occurring at roughly 6-second intervals. On impulse, Pike climbed out of his truck and walked to the exact end point of the tire tracks. The meter's readings spiked, the needle jumping to nearly 10 times the background level, and in that moment, Pike felt something he couldn't quite describe. A pressure, not physical, but present nonetheless, pushing against him from all directions at once. He raised his phone and took a picture of the spot. The camera's flash illuminated the field, and for just an instant, Pike saw something in the flash's afterglow. Tire tracks continuing beyond where they'd appeared to end, faint impressions extending for another 100 feet across the field. Pike blinked, and the phantom tracks were gone, the soil showing no signs of disturbance beyond the documented endpoint. But his phone had captured the image. He reviewed the photo, zooming in on the area beyond the track's terminus. The phantom impressions were there in the digital image, visible proof of something that didn't exist when viewed directly. He sent the photo to Morrison with a text message. These tracks appear in the photo, but not with normal vision. What does that mean? Her response came surprisingly quickly for 3 a.m. Camera sees different wavelengths than human eye. The tracks might exist in a spectrum we can't perceive directly. This is important. Send me your exact GPS coordinates. Pike complied, then waited. 20 minutes later, Morrison's vehicle pulled up beside his truck. She emerged carrying equipment, more meters, a specialized camera, and what looked like a modified Geiger counter. The tracks you photographed are evidence of spatial overlay, Morrison explained as she set up her equipment. 2 locations occupying the same space but slightly out of phase with each other. The camera captured both the physical reality and the displaced overlay. If we can strengthen the overlay signal, we might be able to create a corridor, a way to reach where Creed is trapped. How? I'm not entirely sure. But the electromagnetic resonance that created the original displacement is still active here, just at a lower intensity. If we can amplify it somehow, recreate the conditions that caused the zone activation. She trailed off, working with her instruments. Over the next hour, Morrison took measurements from multiple angles, building a 3-dimensional map of the electromagnetic field. The pattern that emerged showed a roughly spherical area, about 50 feet in diameter, where the field strength was significantly elevated. And at the center of that sphere, Right where the tire tracks ended, the readings went off scale. "This is still an active displacement site," Morrison said, showing Pike her data. "The zone hasn't fully closed. There's a window here, a connection point between our spatial track and wherever Creed and the other driver ended up." "So we can get them back?" "Possibly, but it would require deliberately driving into an active displacement zone, which is incredibly dangerous. And even if we reach them, we'd need a way to navigate back. The zone might not allow reverse transit." Pike didn't hesitate. "I'm going after them." "Mr. Pike, you don't understand the risks. You could end up just as trapped as they are, or worse. The displacement might not preserve your truck's integrity. You could materialize in mid-air, or partially merged with terrain, or in an environment that can't support life." "I understand, but I'm not leaving them out there. Hollis is a rookie. This was probably his first convoy run, and the other driver, whoever he is, doesn't deserve to be abandoned. If there's a chance to bring them back, I'm taking it." Morrison studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Give me 24 hours. I'll see if I can develop a protocol, a way to safely navigate the displacement and return. But Pike, understand this. I'm not guaranteeing success. I'm just promising to try." The protocol Morrison developed was elegantly simple in concept, but terrifyingly uncertain in execution. Using her electromagnetic field data, she'd identified what she called resonance peaks, times when the displacement zone's activity was strongest. The next peak would occur at approximately 6:18 a.m. the following morning, almost exactly 3 days after the original convoy displacement. "The timing is significant," Morrison explained as she briefed Pike, Kowalski, and a team of FBI technicians. "The zones seem to operate on cyclical patterns. Whatever caused the activation 3 days ago will create similar conditions at the same time of day. We can use that predictability." The plan was straightforward. Pike would drive his truck to the displacement site, wait for the resonance peak, and then accelerate directly into the area where the electromagnetic field was strongest. If Morrison's theory was correct, the zone would activate and displace Pike's truck to the same spatial track where Creed and the other driver were trapped. "Once you're displaced, you'll need to locate both trucks and coordinate your positions," Morrison continued. "I'm giving you specialized communication equipment. It won't work across the spatial boundary, but it should function normally within the displaced track. How do I get back? That's the uncertain part. My theory is that if all 3 trucks are at the original displacement coordinates when another resonance peak occurs, the zone will reverse the displacement and return you to normal space, but I can't guarantee that will work." "When's the next resonance peak after the one at 6:18 a.m.? Morrison consulted her data. "Based on the pattern, approximately 24 hours later. So you'd have 1 day to locate the other trucks, gather at the correct coordinates, and wait for the return window. And if it doesn't work, then you'll have to wait for the next peak and the next until you find a configuration that allows reverse transit. Could be days, could be weeks, could be never," Pike said flatly. "Could be never," Morrison agreed. Agent Kowalski objected strenuously to the plan, citing regulations, liability, and the recklessness of intentionally driving into a spatial anomaly. But Pike had already made his decision, and Morrison had secured support from Dr. Webb at Los Alamos, whose credentials gave the operation enough scientific legitimacy to proceed. At 5:47 a.m. on October 18th, Pike sat in his truck at mile marker 183, watching the sky lighten with the approaching dawn. His truck was empty of cargo. Morrison had insisted on minimizing mass to reduce complications during displacement. He'd left a letter with his dispatcher explaining his decision and asking that his family be notified if he didn't return. Morrison's voice came through the specialized radio she'd installed. "Electromagnetic readings are climbing. The resonance peak will occur in approximately 15 minutes. Are you ready? As ready as I'll ever be. Remember, when you cross the boundary, maintain steady speed. Don't brake, don't swerve. Let the displacement carry you through naturally. Pike checked his mirrors one last time. Behind him, several vehicles had gathered to witness the attempt. FBI agents, Morrison's research team, and several other truckers who'd heard about the plan through the informal driver network. They'd set up cameras to document whatever happened, though Pike doubted any camera could capture what he was about to experience. At 6:03 a.m., the gray haze began to form. It appeared first as a shimmer in the air, like heat waves, then gradually solidified into that characteristic luminous gray Pike remembered from 3 days earlier. The haze advanced across the highway, moving from west to east, until it enveloped the displacement site completely. Electromagnetic readings are off scale, Morrison reported. The zone is activating. You should enter in approximately 5 minutes. Pike started his engine, feeling the familiar rumble of power beneath him. He'd driven this truck for 8 years, knew every quirk and response. Now he was about to take it somewhere trucks weren't meant to go. At 6:17 a.m., Morrison's voice came through one final time. Resonance peak imminent. Good luck, Pike. Bring them home. Pike put the truck in gear and accelerated toward the gray haze. As he approached, the luminosity intensified, the gray becoming almost white with inner light. His dashboard instruments began to fluctuate wildly, GPS showing impossible coordinates, speedometer jumping between readings, fuel gauge spinning like a compass needle. And then he was in it. The transition was instantaneous and overwhelming. One moment he was driving through haze on a familiar highway. The next, the world had transformed completely. The gray vanished, replaced by crystal-clear visibility that showed a landscape both familiar and alien. Pike was still on Highway 52, but the highway had changed. The pavement was older, cracked and weathered, with grass growing through splits in the asphalt. The grain fields were gone, replaced by wild prairie that stretched endlessly in all directions. And the sky was wrong. A deeper blue than normal, with clouds that moved in patterns that defied usual weather dynamics. Pike drove forward slowly, his mind struggling to process the displacement. He was here, in whatever here meant, in a version of North Dakota that had developed differently or not developed at all. The existential implications were staggering, but he pushed them aside and focused on his mission: find Creed and the other driver. He keyed the specialized radio Morrison had provided. This is Pike to any convoy members who can hear this transmission. I've crossed through the displacement zone. Please respond with your location. Static was the only response. Pike tried again, broadcasting on multiple frequencies. After the 5th attempt, a voice crackled through. Pike? Is that really you? Hollis, where are you? I don't know exactly. I've been following this highway south trying to find anything familiar. I'm near what looks like an old bridge foundation, but there's no bridge actually there. Pike consulted the mental map he'd built from years of driving Highway 52. I think I know where that is. There's a river crossing about 15 miles from the displacement site. If you're there, I can reach you in about 20 minutes. Pike, how did you get here? Did you get displaced too? Deliberately. I came to bring you back. Have you had any contact with the second truck from our convoy? Negative. I've been alone since I arrived. Haven't seen any other vehicles, any people, nothing. Stay at the bridge foundation. I'm coming to you. Pike drove south on the strange version of Highway 52, his attention divided between the road and the alien landscape around him. Everything felt wrong in subtle ways. The angle of sunlight, the color of the vegetation, even the texture of the air seemed different. And in the distance, he occasionally saw those drifting lights Creed had mentioned, pale glows that moved independently of any visible source. At 6:41 a.m., he spotted Creed's truck parked beside what remained of a bridge foundation, concrete pylons rising from a riverbed that appeared to have dried up decades ago. Creed was standing beside his truck, waving as Pike approached. The rookie driver looked exhausted, his face haggard and eyes showing the strain of 3 days in isolation. When Pike climbed down from his cab, Creed grabbed him in a brief, intense hug. "I thought I was losing my mind," Creed said, his voice unsteady. 3 days in this place, seeing no one, watching those lights at night. I thought I'd be trapped here forever." "You're not trapped," Pike assured him. "We're going to get back. But first we need to find the second truck. Have you seen any sign of him?" "Nothing. I've driven maybe 60 miles in different directions, always on this highway or what's left of it. No other vehicles, no tracks, nothing." Pike keyed his radio again, broadcasting on all frequencies. "Unit 889, this is Thaddeus Pike. If you can hear this, respond immediately. We're organizing return transit through the displacement zone." No response. Pike tried again and again, broadcasting continuously for 5 minutes. The silence as the sun stretched on, broken only by static. "Maybe his radio is dead," Creed suggested, "or he's out of range." "Or he's not on the highway at all," Pike said grimly. "The displacement might have sent him to a different location than us. If the zone activation wasn't uniform, different parts of the convoy could have ended up in different spatial tracks. So what do we do?" Pike checked his watch. The next resonance peak would occur in approximately 18 hours. If they were going to make the return window, they needed to locate the second truck soon. But searching this entire displaced version of North Dakota in less than a day was impossible. "We drive north," Pike decided. "Back to the original displacement coordinates. That's where Morrison calculated the zone would reactivate. If the second driver has any sense, that's where he'll go too." They formed a 2-truck convoy, Pike leading and Creed following at close distance. The drive back north was surreal, the familiar road rendered unfamiliar by the absence of human development. Pike kept watching for any sign of the missing truck, scanning each turnout and side road. At 7:53 a.m., Pike's radio crackled with a new voice. "Is someone broadcasting on this frequency? This is Unit 889 requesting assistance." 889, this is Pike. What's your location?" "I'm on Highway 52, I don't know exactly. My GPS is non-functional. I'm near a grain elevator, but it's abandoned, partially collapsed." Pike thought quickly. There were several grain elevators along Highway 52, but only one that would show as a major landmark. "Are you north or south of the displacement site?" "I don't know where the displacement site is. I've been driving randomly for 3 days." "Okay, stay calm. Can you see any mile markers?" "Wait, there's one coming up. Marker 195. Pike did the math. "You're about 12 miles north of where we need to be. We're heading your way now. Stay put and keep your radio active so we can track your signal." It took 43 minutes to reach Unit 889's position. The driver, a weathered man in his 60s named Marcus Delane, was sitting on his truck's running board when they pulled up. He looked up at their approach with an expression of profound relief. "Thought I was the only one," Delane said simply. 3 days of seeing nothing but prairie and those damn lights. I was starting to think I'd died and this was some kind of purgatory." "You're not dead, and this isn't purgatory," Pike assured him. "This is a displaced spatial track, a parallel version of where we were. And we're going to get back to the real Highway 52. With all 3 trucks accounted for, Pike explained Morrison's plan. They needed to reach the original displacement coordinates and position their trucks exactly where they'd been when the zone had activated. When the next resonance peak occurred, if they were positioned correctly, The zone should reverse the displacement and return them to normal space. And if it doesn't work? Delane asked. Then we wait for the next peak and try again, as many times as it takes. They formed a 3-truck convoy for the drive to the displacement site, reaching the location at 11:37 a.m. Pike used Morrison's GPS coordinates and his own memory of the original convoy positions to mark 3 spots on the highway with spray paint, 1 for each truck. When the resonance peak comes, we need to be in these exact positions, Pike explained. Engine on, transmission in gear, ready to drive, but stationary. The displacement should take us when the zone activates. Should? Creed repeated nervously. It's the best theory we have. Dr. Morrison calculated the return protocol based on electromagnetic field data and displacement mechanics. It should work. They had nearly 8 hours until the predicted resonance peak. Pike suggested they use the time to rest, eat from their emergency supplies, and prepare mentally for the return transit. But as the hours passed, the tension grew. All 3 drivers were haunted by the same unspoken fear. What if Morrison's theory was wrong? What if the zone didn't reverse the displacement? What if they were trapped here permanently? At 5:47 p.m., Pike noticed the gray haze beginning to form. It appeared earlier than Morrison had predicted, which could mean the resonance pattern was accelerating. Or it could mean something else entirely. The displaced spatial track might have its own cyclical phenomena that didn't match the normal world's timing. "All trucks, start your engines," Pike commanded. "Get to your marked positions. This might be our window." They moved quickly, each driver positioning their truck on the appropriate paint mark. Pike checked his mirrors, confirming that Creed and Delane were in place behind him. The gray haze was thickening, developing that characteristic luminous quality. At 6:04 p.m., 14 minutes earlier than Morrison had calculated, Pike felt the pressure wave. It was the same sensation he'd experienced when entering the zone 3 days earlier, a compression from all directions that made his ears pop and his vision blur. "Hold position," Pike transmitted. "Let it take us." The gray intensified until Pike couldn't see beyond his own hood. The pressure increased, becoming almost painful. His instruments went wild again, needles spinning and digital readouts flickering through random values. And then, with a sensation like being pulled backward through thick fluid, the displacement reversed. The gray vanished, replaced by normal afternoon light. Pike found himself back on the familiar Highway 52, the developed fields and distant buildings confirming he'd returned to the correct spatial track. He keyed his radio. "Convoy check. Creed, Delane, did you make it?" "I'm here." Creed responded immediately, his voice shaking with relief. "I'm back. I can see normal highway, normal fields." "Delane here," the older driver confirmed. "We made it. We actually made it." Pike climbed out of his truck on unsteady legs. Behind him, Creed and Delane were doing the same, all 3 drivers standing on the shoulder of Highway 52 in the late afternoon sun, still processing what they'd experienced. Morrison's vehicle came racing up the highway, followed by Agent Kowalski and several FBI cars. Morrison jumped out before her vehicle had fully stopped, running toward the convoy. "It worked," she said, her voice filled with wonder and vindication. "The displacement reversal actually worked." "We weren't sure it would," Pike admitted. "For a while there, I thought we'd be stuck in that place forever." "You just proved that these phenomena can be navigated, that displacement isn't necessarily permanent. This is enormous, Pike. You've opened up an entirely new field of research." Agent Kowalski was more pragmatic. "We need full debriefings from all 3 drivers, medical evaluations, documentation of everything you experienced. This is the first documented case of intentional transit through a spatial anomaly. The implications are..." He trailed off, seemingly overwhelmed by those implications. Over the following weeks, Pike, Creed, and Delane underwent extensive interviews and examinations. Their accounts were consistent, detailed, and impossible to dismiss as hallucination or fraud. The FBI classified much of the investigation, but enough information leaked to the trucking community that Highway 52 acquired a reputation. Many drivers began avoiding it entirely, choosing longer routes rather than risk displacement. Morrison's research received unexpected validation and funding. Universities that had previously dismissed her work suddenly wanted to collaborate, and government agencies approached her about developing protocols for safely studying displacement zones. She credited Pike's courage with making it all possible. For Pike himself, the experience fundamentally changed his relationship with the road. He continued driving, though he never returned to Highway 52. Other routes, other highways seemed safer, less prone to revealing the uncomfortable truth that reality was more flexible than anyone wanted to admit. Hollis Creed left trucking entirely, the trauma of isolation in the displaced track proving too much to overcome. He took a job as a local delivery driver, staying within sight of town and human habitation. Delane retired, using his displacement experience as justification for early pension benefits. But sometimes, on long night drives across empty prairie highways, Pike would notice gray haze forming in the distance. And he'd slow down, change lanes, take the next exit. Whatever was necessary to avoid finding out if another displacement zone was activating. He'd seen what lay beyond normal space, and once was enough. The convoy had vanished into gray, and by some combination of science, courage, and luck, they'd found their way back. But the knowledge of what existed in those displaced tracks, those parallel versions of familiar roads, stayed with Pike. The world was larger and stranger than maps suggested, and sometimes the most dangerous part of any journey wasn't the destination, but the spaces in between. Years later, when young drivers asked him about that October morning, Pike would tell them the truth. I led a convoy into conditions I didn't understand, and we paid the price for that ignorance. 2 of us crossed back safely, but the experience left scars. My advice? Learn to recognize the signs, the gray haze, the electromagnetic interference, the lights that move without vehicles, and when you see those signs, find another route. Some roads lead places you're not meant to go, and no cargo is worth the risk of discovering where those roads end.